Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the XboxEra podcast. I'm joined here with the usual crowd of Shpeshal Ed, Kaironaut, and we have a special guest thanks to Nick's pervasive questioning and pestering. Who do we have with us, Nick?
Very pervasive.
Game director at Moon
Thomas.
Studios, Thomas Mahler. How are you, Thomas?
Yes. Hey guys, I'm really glad to be on the show this time.
Thanks a million for joining us.
It's good to have
Absolutely.
you. Wow.
Yeah, I was looking forward to it. I already watched Adam's podcast last week and thought, hey, this would be fun.
Yeah, Adam.
Very long podcast.
Adam can talk a long time.
Oh yeah.
It's that podcast went on for sort of 3+ hours, and we ended up with an extra hour and a half's worth of material that didn't go into the podcast afterwards. But we weren't recording it; we were just chatting. But it's interesting. It's interesting how passionate as passionate as the fans are. I think for game developers and communities, which is always good to see. So you're working.
I always like seeing that actually. That like. Back when we started, Microsoft had a little bit of that reputation of hey, they're the evil publisher and accountants and so on. But then if you actually get to know a couple of people at Microsoft, I mean, no, it's fine, that kind of thing. And it's always good to see that. I think Adam is exactly the kind of gamer that we all are, right? So
yeah. He had so many hilarious anecdotes because obviously he's been in that industry, especially from an RTS perspective, working on stuff like Command and Conquer. Like he did he did the voice for the spy in the original CNCs, and we're like,
that's crazy. Yeah.
What? What? But it's. I mean,
I was a kid when I played that on my MS-DOS machine.
I feel so young. But it's interesting. So you mentioned that Microsoft often come across as this evil publisher, much like a lot of evil publishers. But in your opinion, I mean, thinking back to when the Xbox One was announced, so we're going back in time to 2013. I can't remember now, and you'll have to refresh my memory. Was Ori revealed at that first 2013 E3, or was it the year after?
It was the year after. In 2014, and I mean, if you're talking about funny anecdotes, here's one for you. Ori was actually planned for a long time as an Xbox 360 title, right? Like we even announced it officially as an Xbox 360 title, and we had a lot of conversations about it with Microsoft about, well, should this even be an Xbox One game, right? And I think it's interesting how the industry has changed, because back then Microsoft was very much in that camp of, oh, we need really high quality, super high poly 3D games to show off the power of the Xbox One, right? And I think the notion was that Ori was not high tech enough to be, to be one of the Xbox launch early games and so on. But I'm really glad we won that battle and told them, guys, this is crazy. Like, we really should be on that platform, and it would help. And now they're all, they've all been on board, and like they treat Ori super, super well. So in that sense,
deservedly so, because I mean, regardless of the technical aspect of 3D versus 2D, Ori looks like a Studio Ghibli painting come to life.
But I think you still have that kind of notion a little bit, though, right? That 2D games are not like, they're seen as, hey, they're a little bit cheaper than 3D games. And honestly, I mean, I've been working on the Ori series for almost 10 years now. We started to work on it in 2011.
Yeah.
Like did the very first early tests in end of 2010 around that time, and then started working on it in 2011. And then there was the definitive edition, blah, blah, blah. But long story short, I mean, I've been working on this stuff for like 8 years, and the thing with engines is a lot of the engines that are out there, right, like Unreal Engine and Unity and so on, if you're working on a 3D game, they actually do a lot of work for you. Like there's a lot of stuff that is just shared, and they're doing that for you. But with our stuff, we have to do everything basically from scratch, because there's nothing, especially when we started, the Unity 2D package wasn't even there. And honestly, like even now, it isn't like at a level where it would be good enough for our needs. So we had to write all of that ourselves, and it was really brutally difficult. And a lot of times, like doing 2D is just, oh my god, why are we doing that? That's so dumb.
Yeah, but it looks so good though.
No, I'm really happy with the control that you get, over every frame and making sure that everything looks amazing. which is hard to get in 3D because, like, hey, yeah, if your depth map shadows just have artifacting it, well, tough shit. That's what it is, right? But we actually do have control over every pixel. So I like it from that aspect. But I mean, you saw it even with Rayman, right? Like Ubisoft back then tried to sell Rayman for like, what, $60 or $50 or something, right?
Just didn't
there
fly.
was this outcry. Yeah, there was this outcry for, oh my God, this is way too expensive for a 2D game, right? And it's kind of strange, but I think the industry has changed very much for the better, especially also with the Switch, and just generally that like how indie games have risen kind of like to be a much more potent thing in this industry versus the status you had just a couple of years ago.
It's interesting because when the Xbox One launched, not only were they beaten over the head with a terrible launch, which has haunted them to this day, but you had that offset in mindset, at least from an outside perspective, that the Xbox One was not very indie friendly and Microsoft didn't care about indies. And then you had the PlayStation camp where arguably their first couple of years on the market were very much supported by smaller, more unique indie games. And almost from my perspective, at least as a consumer, that role has significantly flipped, where you have the Idea Xbox program and Microsoft are happily putting these arguably massive indie games on stage that are unique art experiments as well as just games, and they're treated with as much respect and revere as you would with a la-di-da AAA release. I mean, for me, Ori and the Blind Forest, the original, was the game on the Xbox that I was like, honey, you've got to come in here and watch this. Just watch this intro. Now, why aren't you crying? And you don't get that now so much on the PlayStation camp. It just seems that they don't care as much now. I don't know whether that's actually accurate or not. But
I think in that sense, it's just like making film or any medium, right? Where it really just depends on the talent and like what are you putting into, right? Like how much passion did you put into it? Is the script good? All of that stuff is much more important than just what is the actual output, right? Like and I mean in terms of like the style that you used or any of that stuff, right? Like, but I think you always have that a little bit, like when black and white films were the standard, right? That like when that was the status quo, I think. I'm pretty sure like back then there was the same thing, right? Where it's like, well, black and white is cheap. We all want color now, right? When in reality, well, something like 12 Angry Men is just, timeless and it's a classic, right?
Good movie.
Whereas a lot of kind of like color films that came out back then, right? Like who cares, right? And yeah, I think it's very much just depends always on, well, what is the quality of the output? What team has been working on that? Were they really passionate about that? That kind of thing.
One thing I was going to ask, correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas, but the 360 port of Ori and the Blind Forest, that exists and it's finished, isn't it?
It's not finished completely, but I have an Xbox 360 dev kit here that actually has Ori and the Blind Forest on it. It ran at 720p and so on. I mean, maybe at some point, like it would be interesting to show that somewhere.
Finish it.
No.
At this point, I don't think that's even an option on the table.
I mean, we thought we would still do it for quite some time, honestly. Yeah. But then there was this whole Microsoft initiative with like Windows 10 and so on, and like, hey, can you guys do a UWP version? And we took that opportunity to take that, budget for the UWP version and just basically say, well, let's improve it all across the board because there's a couple of suggestions that fans have and a couple of things that they didn't like. So we just took that to make the definitive edition, right? Because there were things in there where we felt like, whoops, like, for example, not being able to go back into the game once you finished it, like those kind of things, or like the warping, actually. And here's another funny anecdote. The actual warping that you would be able to fast travel from any spirit world, right? The entire game has always been built around that, right? And we just never got around to do the actual, like to do the implementation of like the warping and so, because then you have to do scene loading and you have to figure out exactly, well, what is that? How long will that little animation take for Ori to spin at a spirit well so that you can actually stream in the scene and so on. And if you actually look at the implementation, it's very clever, right? Where it's like, actually go to a spirit well, you hit the button, then it asks you, where do you want to go, right? And the reason why we did it like that is because then you have the data for like, oh, the player wants to go to this scene, so now let's spin up the animation and we take that time to actually load the whole scene, right? Because to us it's super important that there are no perceivable loading times or anything in Ori like that, right? Where it's just you have to load. But we had that, the whole game was always built around that, right? And I remember being at, I think it was TGA's or something like that. And we talked to our executive producer back then, Mark Coates. And we were like 1 or 2 months or so away from shipping, from like, you know, content complete and so on. And we told him in an Uber, like, hey, Mark, we still really want to do that, right? And that was the time where it's like, guys, everything is locked. Like, you guys are nuts. You can't add any more, right? And we were really down on that, like not having fast travel. That sucked really hard. But we shipped the game without, and it was okay, you know. But then for the definitive edition, like with that kind of like Windows 10 budget, we actually were finally able to do that.
It's interesting when that definitive edition dropped, because there were those little things, because Ori already was this absolutely stellar game in my opinion, and it was like one of my favorites of 2015. 2015 is when it released, right?
March of 2015, yeah.
And I completed it back to back, and I was like, damn it, I missed like that one thing in the Ginso tree, and I missed this other little one thing, and it's like, oh, that's frustrating. And the fact that got announced, and I remember you being quite active on God, would it have been NeoGAF back then?
NeoGAF back then.
Yeah, I think back then it was still NeoGAF,
yeah.
And you were like, don't worry, guys. And you were like, here's a checklist of everything that we're focusing on.
I remember that.
I always like that you know, like listen to your fans, and then, hey, if there's something, like I always listen for feedback. Like if you actually follow my posts and so on a little bit, like even when we made the sequel, I like, even when we started out, right, I wrote like in the Resetera, I think it was then, or it could be still NeoGAF. I had like threads, and there was like, hey, if we would potentially theoretically make a sequel, what would you guys like to see in it, and so on, right? Guys, I like that whole community aspect. I like how Blizzard used to handle that a lot with their community, right? That you just take in, hey guys, what did you think about the game, right? And then if there's stuff where it's like, hey, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea, or, you know, like you really listen to that feedback, then you bring it in. I always like that aspect, because honestly, like I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and the products that we have out there, it really hurts. It really sucks if there's a little thing that isn't quite right? And then being able to actually do that is so nice.
Well, I think Blizzard's biggest example of that would be, was it Diablo 3? Like kind of almost universally hated by some of the hardcore at launch, and then they really genuinely listened and implemented feedback. I kind of, it's interesting to think about Blizzard, considering everything that they're in trouble about at the moment. So I won't dive into any politics, but Diablo 3 was a real kind of turnaround for them, where they were like, yep, you're right, we're wrong, here you go. And they listened. Yeah. It's good to see developers do that. I mean, talking of posts on forums, there was one post I think you made last year and I think it's not a direct quote, so people can go look it up, but I think you posted something along the lines of something that will surprise the industry, and obviously that is, I presume you were referring to back then, the
Ori on Switch,
the release of Ori on the Nintendo Switch. I mean, what was that conversation like with Microsoft?
I posted that because we thought that would be a huge deal, you know, because
it is, arguably.
Yeah, of course, but like here's how we perceived it in the studio, right? Like we talked to Microsoft, and we brought up this whole thing of like, hey, what do you guys think about like putting it on the Switch? And to our surprise, they were actually open to that, right? Like normally, like if I'd probably, like, you know, if we would have a deal with Sony or Nintendo, and you would approach Nintendo about like, hey, how do you guys feel about putting our game on the PlayStation? I think the conversation would be very different. Like Microsoft is following a very different strategy, I think, at this point. And from our perspective, it was this holy shit, Microsoft is putting a first-party title on a Nintendo platform. That's crazy, that's huge.
Yeah.
So I posted it from that, idea, like, hey, this would be pretty big news. And then right after that, those fucking Cuphead developers came out. So suddenly we were like, oh, so nobody's gonna care anymore.
Sorry, man.
Thanks, Cuphead. You fucking.
No, actually, I love Studio MDHR and what they're doing and so on. I'm a fan myself of the animation style that they have and everything, right? But it's like, oh shit, we could have been nice if we would have talked about that a little bit.
It's interesting, we were talking about the difference between 2D and 3D games. I mean, Cuphead is, from an art direction standpoint, in terms of what they achieved, is utterly phenomenal. And even though it's arguably not my style of game, I do not have the skill nor the patience to make it through a boss game effectively. And even though they did add some of the sort of more platformy bits, I bought it knowing full well I would never complete this fucking thing because it was just so cool to look at, and it speaks again to that power and that difference. It got its own fanfare, not because it was AAA, but because it was so unique. And I think that's where Ori sits. Is it's yes, there's a genre there of Metroidvania, but it is just it's so unique in its presentation, its art style. It ticks a lot of boxes for a lot of people. And the beginning of Ori, in terms of its emotional depth, is arguably, from a storytelling perspective, better than most AAA games anyway. It's just interesting seeing that mind shift occur over those times. Cairo, I think you were about to say something, weren't you?
I just wanted to ask, like the whole conversation of like people dismissing 2D games out of hand because they're not as high quality as 3D or whatever. I think that it'd be interesting to know what the design decision went into making, because I think Ori and the Blind Forest was a 2.5D platformer, right? So you had 3D rendered like backgrounds and assets in a 2D plane.
Actually, no. It is like we're using a 3D engine, but everything was flat. Like we did, the Moonity engine. Back then it was still just Unity. We actually rewrote everything, which is why we started calling it something different. Because now, if you open our Unity, like the Moonity engine, it's very different. Like it uses almost nothing anymore from Unity. There's still the overall architecture is the same, so that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot and like, now you have to rewrite everything. But everything, like how we render stuff and so on, all the tools and so on, are our own. Sorry, I think I forgot the initial question.
I was
still like, sorry.
So Ori and the Blind Forest was fully 2D, right? All 2D. Okay.
Yeah, it's all 2D. Like we even took we had 3D characters models because we wanted to have really fluid animations, and we had an animator named James Benson who was absolutely amazing. I think right now he's working actually on Half-Life 3. Because he went to the
exclusive.
I don't know. I just say that based on the rumors. I have no inside information or anything. But he went to Campo Santo after Moon, and Campo Santo got bought up, right? But he was an amazing animator, and he wanted to do that 3D stuff, but that got all converted into 2D. So very similar to how they did it for Donkey Kong Country and so on, and we kind of like rendered it in a way where it still looks, fitting for 2D.
Is Ori and the Will of the Wisps kind of the same, or is it more 3D in a 2D?
No, Ori this time, like the actual characters are all 3D, simply because we wanted to do a bunch of things. They're like you will notice the animation is way smoother, right? Simply because doing 2D sprites the way we did it was just absolutely insane. Like Kuro, for example, was a 1024 by 1024 texture, and filling the memory with that, and the animations that you needed for like something that huge was just crazy. And then also you couldn't do a bunch of things. Like we always thought it would be cool. Wouldn't it be cool if Ori could hold on to this thing, and we would actually use the rig and so on, and you couldn't do that. So we made our tests with 3D, and it actually worked out well this time for us.
That's good. I guess my whole question was like, what influenced the change in that direction for Will of the Wisps? But I guess if Will of the Wisps is essentially the same, then that question.
It's very similar. Like basically, we still wanted to have that similar style, right? Like I absolutely did not want to do something where it's like you would see the 3D-ness of the characters in that 2D world. Because honestly, I'm not that big of a fan of what those other 2.5D games look like. Like usually with 2.5D platformers, you end up with these really low poly backgrounds that just don't look that pretty, right? And we paint everything, and you don't see any polygons or any of that. So we absolutely did not want that. But we made our tests, and suddenly, like immediately, we saw, oh my god, the animations are so much smoother. And just the team was just convinced that this looks great, and we can do a whole bunch of stuff now with blending and so on, because we couldn't blend, like you can't blend sprites, but now with the rigs inside and so on, we can do animation blending and so on. So generally speaking, you will see that the animations are much smoother. In Blind Forest, we had sprites that rendered at 30 frames, and actually, I shared this information before. But for the Switch port, because so many of the optimizations that we did now in the Moonity engine that we did for Will of the Wisps ended up in the Switch port for Ori, and that freed up a lot of stuff. And it's like we actually tried to put to up the animation quality for Blind Forest to 60 frames animation for Ori, and that actually ended up now in the Switch port. But for Will of the Wisps, like everything has those 60 frames animations and so on. It just looks really, really, really smooth.
Yeah, it's cool. Good. I think I had mentioned a while back that there was a build at PAX Australia a year ago, and they had a certain level there set up, and you noticed the difference. Like when you play it, it was unbelievable. I don't know. Did you know that they had a build at PAX last year?
It was the Windswept Waste build, right, with the desert stuff and so on.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. No, we showed that. We showed that around before. That's when we wanted to show off a bunch of gameplay and so on, right? Because we started with like introducing the game with just cinematics, and we had this really cute thing at 2017, I think, where we introduced 2017, where we introduced all these. Like you would just see the environments, and we're going slowly through environments that are painted, right? And then at the very end, you see this little owl, and she's standing there and she's looking at that graveyard full of owls, right? And then Ori comes in and so on. So it was all a very cinematic introduction. And then for the next year, we thought, okay, well, if we want to go real now, we have to show gameplay and what's different, and let's really focus on the combat system, and let's show off new enemies and like really what are new moves in there. And that kind of stuff. So that build we made that to show like all these new things and like how the game plays.
Yeah, and actually this just occurred to me. I never actually knew like what was the inspiration behind the world of Ori and the story in the first game, and presumably the story in the second game. Like what's the main inspiration? Like books, novels, comics, movies, whatever, music. Like, where do you draw most of that? Like, where do you guys draw most of those ideas from?
Long as possible. Version or the short version?
Up to you.
I'm not gonna pull an Adam. I'm not gonna pull an Adam, but I can actually speak to that a little bit. So here's the thing. Like, I used to work at Blizzard Entertainment. I worked in StarCraft 2 in the cinematics department in Blizzard cinematics department. And I finished my work in 2009. And what was really interesting at that time was 2008 was when Braid was released and Castle Crashers and so on, right? And it was such a revolution to me that suddenly you saw these small developers with like one or two, like studios with like one or two people. It wasn't even a studio, one or two people actually releasing something, right? And And I got really passionate about that idea because, like, back then, if you guys remember during the PlayStation 1 days and like Xbox One and GameCube and so on, if you wanted to make a game, I mean, you would have to invest at least $1 million into it. There was just nothing like the way you can do indie games right now. Just the Unreal Engine back then, if you wanted to license it, it's like $500,000, you know? So it was super expensive, and there was just no way, unless you're a big company that can waste a bunch of money, there was no way for people to make games. So when I first got the job at Blizzard, there was a whole process where I had to wait for to get a visa to actually work in the US. And there was a time when I actually just started dabbling with prototyping, and like learning how to code stuff and so on. And I got really passionate about that. And like when that happened, the whole 2008 thing with like Braid became huge and Castle Crashers became huge. I was talking to a friend of mine back then who I knew for years, who's now my co-founder in the studio, Gennady Korol. And we both became really passionate about, hey, let's just try something, let's prototype around a little bit. Maybe that'll turn into something interesting. And back then, I worked on StarCraft 2, and the initial idea for Moon, like for our first project, was let's try to do a first-person shooter thing that isn't a shooter, but plays more like StarCraft 2 in first person. And that project was called War Soup. And we actually showed it on YouTube, and had a little video up, and every gaming site suddenly out there like had that video, posted it. And that was crazy. That was really exciting to, oh my God, like we just showed this little thing and like suddenly there's 150,000 views or something in just a couple of days. And suddenly we had publishers reaching out to us. Like I remember being in London, like actually flying to London and have like, oh yeah, I'm going to Electronic Arts, and then the Microsoft person is picking me up right at Electronic Arts doorsteps to actually pitch the same thing to Microsoft. And when we talked to Microsoft, I think it became very clear very quickly that the idea was, the notion for the publishers was that we're in over our heads, that, hey, we are 2 people right now. I think, no, we were 4 at that time. And we were like, hey, let's compete with all these first-person shooters out there. And Microsoft was just, guys, this is crazy. You can't do it. So come back to us if you have anything else, right? Like basically, they didn't say that straight out, but that was kind of like the notion.
The implication.
The implication. So we just dabbled around a little bit, and we showed that trailer for War Soup end of 2010. And on the 24th of December, on Christmas Day it's Christmas Day in Europe, in Austria. I think for you guys, it's the 25th, right? In the States.
Yeah.
So in the morning, I watched Princess Mononoke. And I just really like the idea of like, hey, I like these little forest spirits. So I just got up on the 24th and like sat down and made a little platformer demo with just a white little character. And then I showed that to the team, and everybody got really excited. Everybody was like, actually, we always wanted to make something like that, And we just decided to do that. Then 4 months later, so we showed that to Microsoft, and that's ultimately what became Ori and the Blind Forest.
Wow.
And where we take our inspiration from, like that little wisp thing, like that, forest spirit, that definitely came from that Miyazaki Princess Mononoke thing. I take inspiration from pretty much everything, like whatever I see, and when I read something and so on, there's always this, like, hey, maybe something like that could work and so on, right? Like there's always a little bit of that, but mostly I think for Ori, I love the process of sitting down with an empty piece of paper, and whether you draw something or whether you write something and so on, right? That whole process of, hey, I start the day with an empty piece of paper, and by the end of the day, I have something, and there's something interesting there, and that was made out of nothing. There is something truly magical in that, like in the process of creating things, right?
Yeah.
And then you get really excited about that. And I mean, I don't know exactly how our brains work, right? But you just start writing those lines, and and kind of like write that concept. And suddenly it's like, yeah, that sounds really interesting. Let's pitch that to the team and let's see what they say. So that's pretty much how it happens at Moon.
Wow. So it's interesting. You know, we've talked about 3D, 2D, AAA versus indie. You've been working on Ori for over a decade, effectively, right? So is there? I mean, I remember a couple of years back, and I might be wrong here. I'm sure you threw up a prototype of like a top-down Geometry Wars style, but you were like I can't remember if it was in like a graveyard. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I remember playing a little demo thing. So obviously you guys prototype a bunch of stuff probably pretty quickly before you decide like what you're going to work on. Does the studio know already like what's after Ori and the Will of the Wisps? Have you already got like this grand plan? Not asking for a reveal because sometimes it's fun to find out of the blue.
I'm not going to reveal anything, but I said it before. Like, we have been working on another title for quite some time already. The first things I did for that title was actually even back in 2015, and we do prototypes all the time. There's even a little kart racing prototype out there that I made simply because I played Super Mario Kart and the Super Nintendo back then, and it was like, I want to try something like that, you know, like I think that could be fun, and like figuring out how to drift and that kind of stuff, and we do that all the time at Moon when we have to figure out, you know, what's next. There's also a project that we pitched to Oculus at some point. It was almost like a Minecraft meets SimCity kind of thing, because I thought it would be so cool. Like when I met with the Oculus guys in 2015, we got a little demo of the virtual reality thing with the hands for the first time, and that was just mind-blowing to me. Wow. So I thought it would be so cool to sit in a virtual space where you would build these blocks up and would have a whole ecosystem, right? And just have you guys ever played SimCity on the Super Nintendo?
Yeah, I played that game, but on the PC.
That particular version is a little bit of a cuter version of SimCity, and I always loved that game. You know, like I to this day I don't understand the logic. I can't build stuff or shit, but it's just really fun. It's just really fun to kind of like place these things down and so on. So we even made a prototype back then for Oculus where it's like, hey, you would build these, you know, this little block city, and you would have to figure out how all these blocks are connected and what they do and so on. And yeah, we do that all the time. And yeah, I can't say what the project is that we're working on, the secret project, but it is something huge. We actually now, like by the end of Blind Forest, we shipped the game with 20 people in the studio, and that was including all contractors and everything, right? And now we shipped Definitive Edition. Then we shipped Ori on the Switch now, and we are about to ship Will of the Wisps, and we have another project in the background. And by now we're 80 people in the studio. Wow. So it's been pretty crazy, yeah.
That's a huge uptick in growth. I mean,
yes,
Have you ever thought about taking Ori down that route of sort of platformer classics like Mario 64 or Banjo Kazooie, and taking that art style and that exploration into a 3D space where you've got a 3D Ori with this huge kind of almost like an open world kind of feel, these big areas. Has there ever been a desire or discussion internally to do that?
That comes up all the time at the studio, like all the time. We made a 2D game, 2D platformer, obviously the next thing, and it even happens to other studios, right? Like Yacht Club constantly is like, hey, when are you guys making Shovel Knight 64, right? So internally, that discussion came up even during the Blind Forest days. Like, hey, will the next thing that we do, will that be a 3D platformer, right? And honestly, for Will of the Wisps, I just like the idea of perfecting what we came up with. Like, to me, the idea with Will of the Wisps was, I want Will of the Wisps to be the Blind Forest what Super Mario Bros. 3 was the Super Mario Bros. 1. So basically, take that core concept that is already really strong, right, with the platformer mechanics and everything that we have, but improve everything, right? Like, just really try to perfect it. So that's the route that I wanted to take with that. But yeah, we did think about 3D platformers for quite some time, and it always comes up. It's just really hard. Like Ori is this very much, like a precision platformer with really wall jump, like stuff. So that concept is really difficult to do in 3D. Also, I have a lot of respect for doing 3D cameras in a 3D platformer because nobody ever tackles that right. Even the Nintendo games, they're doing it the best, right?
Yeah.
But even then, you still have like little nags with the camera every now and then.
Completely.
And we actually hired one of the lead level designers from Rayman, because Ubisoft isn't doing any Rayman or 2D stuff anymore, right? Simply because, well, it didn't end up making money for them, which is really dumb because we showed how you can be really successful with a 2D platform. And we grabbed him, and he's also like super excited also about the idea of like, hey, maybe a 3D platformer at some point, right? We even also thought about, I mean, I really shouldn't say this, but we did have conversations about should Boot Studios do Banjo 3, right? Like, should we work with Microsoft on Banjo? That kind of thing came up before, but yeah, I don't know. Like, maybe not. We'll
Stop,
see.
Nick. You're gonna have an aneurysm. Just calm down.
Nick's,
it's funny. This might sound left field, but I reckon with your studio's reputation for precise control, and you guys, I feel like no matter which genre you guys tackle, you would do everything in your power to understand the nuance and the minutiae of what it takes to create a good game in that genre. I reckon you guys might be pretty good at a fighting game. Maybe you guys should try to tackle that in the future. Maybe Killer Instinct 2, maybe, who knows?
I can't, I can't say anything about what we're working on next, but yeah, we'll see, right? But yeah, I think definitely we are the kind of studio where it's like we don't necessarily care about impressing people with like super fancy tech, even though our tech department is pretty great, like what they're pulling off is pretty bananas. And again, like we have a bit of this thing of like, oh, like you guys are making 2D games, but well, the tech behind that and to actually get the games to look like that and still perform like that, especially then on hardware like Switch and so on, you really need to know what the hell you're doing, right? Like you see a lot of Unity games out there and Unreal games out there that just don't perform on that level.
Yeah.
But we very much like, in terms of like our development philosophy, we are that kind of studio where it's like, I do not even start production on a game until I have a prototype where even in the gray box state, it's more fun than other games in that genre, right?
Yep.
Unless I have that, I'm not even going to go to production. And it's very much just driven, like similar. I think it's very, very similar to Nintendo, how Nintendo designs games, right? Because it's all about that play aspect. And unless I have a prototype that is already better, that is already like really, really good at what it's doing, I'm not going to move forward, because it's the same with like Pixar and storyboards and so on, right? Where it's like, well, if the film doesn't work in the animatic, then doing some fancy models and like putting lights on top of it and so on is not going to make it that much better. Like if the foundation isn't there, then you don't have anything, And I think that's not the case, like how most AAA studios work, because they can't, because if you make an Assassin's Creed or something, like it comes together probably in the last 3 or 4 months. And that's when you actually see, oh, this is what this will play like, and this is what this project will become, simply because, well, so many things have to happen at the same time. And I just never want to be a studio like that. I always want to have something where it's like, no, actually we are gameplay first. And unless when we start, and the prototype, that is already really good, we don't even go into production.
That's good. That's a cool mantra to have. I know I already mentioned this before we started recording, but I recently threw up in the XboxEra Discord. I was like, hey guys, I'm going to take my Switch, because I had to fly to Atlanta in the US last week, and I was like, I'm going to take my Switch, like, any recommendations? And people were shouting some games, and I was just looking through the store. I ended up double dipping on Ori and the Blind Forest again on Switch.
Cool.
And it was hilarious to me, because I'm sitting there on an economy flight, because my company don't pay for business class, and I'm sitting there and I get to the Ginso tree right now. When I played Ori and the Blind Forest, traditionally Metroidvanias and precision platformers, it's not usually my kind of game, but I was so in love with the art style and the spiritually kind of feeling of Ori that I absolutely adored it. And I got to the Ginso tree, and that was the difficulty spike, right? It was like, yeah, and it really. So I'm sitting there on the plane. It's like, I've got this. Now I foolishly perhaps booted the game up on hard instead of like easy or normal, and I was dying. I get like halfway, die, and I was like, I really just want to get past it because I loved the scene afterwards where you drop down and the waters are clear and you've got that like kind of fluty music in the background. It's like, this is nice and chill, and it was cracking me up because I remember that difficulty spike back when I originally played it. With regards to Will of the Wisps, obviously you had a couple of trailers, one where we saw some of the perhaps evolutions of those escape events or boss type events. Would you say that the team at your end has kind of heard some of that feedback for some of those people that perhaps aren't as reflexive as most, and want to steer away from some of those difficulty spikes? And is it perhaps a little bit more gradual? Is it because what I loved about the Ginso tree was like, here's Bash, here's how to use Bash. We're going to teach you. Now you need to use Bash really well. Do you see that some of that has come through? Some of those lessons have come through when you've been developing the sequel?
For sure, that has been one of the biggest topics, and also obviously for Microsoft, right? Because their whole thing was, hey, can we make this a little bit more approachable? Because even during the Blind Forest days, there was a lot of, guys, this game is really beautiful, and I think there's going to be a lot of players out there who would like to play this just for the story, right? Because they're going to be captured by the first 10 minutes, and then they would just want to go through it, and suddenly you smack them in the face with this really difficult platformer, right? And we thought about like. That's again like that probably comes from me growing up with 8-bit games and 16-bit games and so on, and like really that sense of, but I want that challenge, I want to feel like I overcame something big and so on. So here's how we handle that for Will of the Wisps. The immediate, like the logical thing is, just let's make the game easier, right? And let's remove all these spikes, and let's just generally have enemies deal less damage and all this stuff, right? But I didn't want to water it down. Like I think there's like the idea to me just felt wrong that, hey, let's just take all the challenge out of it. Because at the core, Ori is really a precision platformer. It's in that vein of Super Meat Boy and those kind of things, or N+ and even Celeste, right? All those kind of things. Like those are all precision platformers, and there is something really nice about this pixel perfect jumping and so on. So just removing the challenge wasn't the right idea. So how we tackled it, how we approached it was to say, let's give the player options. Let's really say there's a couple of things that we noticed, right? Like for example, with the Ginso tree. We actually in Blind Forest saved your game the moment the water came rushing in, right? And then you were basically at a point where it's like, some players started the Ginso tree escape sequence with like really little health. And then they had to just play it perfectly, right? And that honestly, I think was a bit of a dumb decision from us. So now in any of the, if you have a sequence like that in Will of the Wisps, usually you can just hit start and then just board the challenge, right? And then you're just being portaled back to kind of like the save point from before. And generally speaking, that goes into this whole design philosophy of like, hey, but you can go anywhere else and you can come back to this, when you feel ready again. And there's a lot more content in Will of the Wisps. Like you can just keep exploring, like look at the overworld and so on. And it takes some cues from Zelda for sure, right? Like for example, in Zelda, you don't usually go from, I just finished this dungeon, so let me immediately go to the next dungeon, right? Like what happens usually is that players just get this item from this dungeon and then they roam around the overworld and they get a bunch of stuff and they explore a little bit and they get some more heart containers and they get a couple of, bottles filled up with potions and so on. And that's pretty much where we ended up with. Like basically, if some challenge is too difficult for you, that's fine, no problem. Just back out of it, portal out. Like basically now we have fast travel in the game, so just use that fast travel and go someplace else, right? Explore a little bit further, get some new abilities. We have this whole spirit shard system in the game now, that is kind of like this evolution of the ability tree, where you get these shards. Like now it's not this traditional skill system where it's like, first you need to get this skill in order to actually unlock this skill, in order to then unlock this skill. Yeah. We just basically ripped it apart and said, okay, actually these little orbs, you can find them in the world now, and you can just equip them, you know, like there is no requirement anymore. You can just find stuff now, and you can also upgrade that, right? So we said, look, if players have problems with the platforming, if they have trouble with platforming and being really precise, well, let's give them a couple of shards that make things easier. Triple jump, for example, is a shard now. So if you feel like, hey, you have trouble with platforming, well, invest early into triple jump, right? Or those kind of things. Then there's shards that make you more defensive, or shards that make you more offensive. There's shards that are risk and reward, where it's like, if I equip this shard, I will deal more damage, but I will also take more damage, and so on, right? So we approached it from this angle to really say, actually, it's still a challenging game. We don't want to take the challenge out, but if you feel overwhelmed by something, it's totally safe to back out, do a couple of things, you know, like basically buff yourself up, and then come back to it, you know, like you can immediately warp to that spot, and then now I want to try again, that kind of thing, right? So that it still has that challenge, but you have so many more options on how you approach that stuff. Definitely, like in terms of spikes, right? That's something that we're just always trying to figure out, that you don't have, oh, this is on this level of difficulty, and then bam. For Blind Forest, the reason why that happened was because we thought of the escape sequences like bosses, right?
Yeah.
The idea was Blind Forest's combat system was, to us, not quite on the same level of importance as the platforming. To us, the platforming was number one, and then we also wanted to have the enemies in there and so on. But the platforming in Blind Forest, the idea was that would become the combat system, right? That with bash and so on, you would start doing cool maneuvers like, hey, that enemy is throwing a projectile at me, so I can use my bash ability to actually throw the projectile back at him. And that is actually more efficient than just walking up to the enemy and hitting the button, right? So the escape sequence, we saw that as bosses, right? We saw that as, well, actually just hitting this thing with sign would not be that fun. So why not go crazy on like designing these really nuts, you know, challenges at the end of every dungeon, right? And that's where the spike came from, really, because the idea was, okay, you learned all this stuff, we taught it to you step by step. Now you got to show your stuff, you know. So, but I think I think sometimes we went a little nuts on this, and also some of the escape sequence came in pretty late in production, and we weren't able to playtest it as fully as other things. But at the same time, I mean, I like the outcome, because if you look at all those YouTube videos and so on, you have literally people that play with the controller that died for 20 times, right? And then they do the escape sequence, they throw the controller away and they scream into the camera, they're like, yeah, I finally did it, you know? Yeah. That feeling, that's something you only get from games, you know? Like, or if you do sports or something, right? That accomplishing something, overcoming a challenge, you know, and really feeling like that happened because of my skill, because I did it, I got better at it, and I made it, you know, that feeling is so fulfilling. So that's also one of the reasons why I didn't want to take that out of Will of the Wisps. And I hope people still get that feeling, but without, like, generally without, hopefully, a lot of frustration coming before.
Yeah. It reminds me of, because the woman on the plane sitting next to me was like looking at me like, what are you doing, you crazy? Because I was like, fuck. And then when I did it, I was like, exactly. It's ridiculous, but there you go. It's things you get up to on a 10-hour flight. So I mean, that's really heartening to hear, because you know, it was not a criticism as such, but it was just something I was aware of as I get older and inevitably get a lot slower. You know, it just always sticks for me. But I kind of say to myself, look, you completed Ninja Gaiden Black, you can complete anything. Because that's one of those games that was like,
that's the
boss,
same for me with those
and it's just you think to yourself, I can't do this, there's no way, and then you do it and you're like, I am literally shit hot, and then you get to the next boss and you're like, okay, this is just stupid, and then you do it somehow, and it's just like, yeah, I miss that feeling in games, and not a lot of games have the courage to do that nowadays. A lot of them like hold your hand all the way through. Don't worry, you're the best. There was one thing I was curious about, and this often happens with sequels, and there's a couple of ways that I've seen developers handle it. You get a sequel, and you're like, where am I starting off? Am I Ori as I was at the end of Blind Forest, where I've got Bash, I've got Triple Jump, I've got all of these skills? Or are we going to have that kind of classic way of a game to show you stuff? So you start off with everything as peak as you can be, super challenging moment, you lose, you're stripped back to zero, and you've got to go out there and complete the game. Like how, without spoiling the game, because obviously I appreciate that could be a spoiler.
Well, there's a lot of new stuff in this one.
Exactly. So how do you balance that? How do you narratively take your character back to basics so that you can go through that Metroidvania style collectathon of leveling up that character, like without narratively not making sense?
So Will of the Wisps does not take place in Ibel anymore.
Oh, okay.
That's one thing. And the other, like, I don't want to spoil, especially the start of the game, because we put a ton of time into designing the start of the game. But yeah, it's not taking place in Ibel anymore. And, take of that what you want.
We'll leave it there. That's an interesting answer.
We do know that there's a whole bunch of new combat moves now.
Like a sword type thing, which I was like, ooh.
Yes. There's a lot of new moves in there, and so on. We also have completely revamped the combat system, right? Like we saw people, like we saw Hollow Knight coming out, and actually, we've been working on Will of the Wisp before Hollow Knight was a thing. And we saw them doing a combat system, and people always go on about like, hey, but the Hollow Knight combat system is really cool, right? And it's like, well, it's actually interesting that we wanted to improve Metroidvanias by really focusing on the platforming component. Because honestly, if you look at your typical Metroidvania, if you look at Symphony of the Night and Super Metroid, yes, they do have platforming, but it's very simple, right? It's not on the level of Mario. Like the level design the level design in Symphony of the Night and Super Metroid are not on the same level of quality that you would have in a Mario game. So that's where we wanted to improve things. Like, to me, it just made no sense that, hey, if one of your core aspects, if one of the core hooks of the game is platforming, like jumping around these levels, why wouldn't the levels and the platforming component be as good, as Mario? Yeah. Like that should be the case. So that's where we took it. And then Team Cherry came in and did Hollow Knight, and they did a much more traditional thing, right? Or Axiom Verge, for example, also did a much more traditional approach to Metroidvanias. And I think that's fine. But in terms of the combat system, we wanted to kind of, like, I always like that competition and the challenge and say, okay, you guys did that. Let's see how you can follow up and we do this now, like that kind of thing. So yeah, we saw that as a bit of a challenge to say, hey, actually, let's completely take a look at the combat system, and let's also bring in that component. Like, the combat should be on the same level as the platforming was, and let's merge that together, and let's really make all of that work together in this symbiotic way, where you also use your combat for platforming a bunch of times and so on, right? That was the idea there.
Yeah, I saw when I was playing Will of the Wisps last year, I noticed that obviously something very different from Blind Forest was that when you get these moves, you can assign them to a button, or at least in the build I was playing, that's how it worked. All the different moves that you have now can assign to a button, but you actually had a lot more moves than there was buttons to assign them to.
Yes.
So my assumption is now that that's going to play a big part in you tackling each scenario, assigning a particular combat move or new move to a button with each part of the game, if that makes sense.
The idea was we wanted people to be able to, because Ori, and that actually was a surprise to us, Ori became huge in the speedrunning community. I mean, there's people out there right now that finish Ori and the Blind Forest in like 13 minutes or something like that.
That
crazy.
Is insane to me. I can't even imagine the skill required.
Yeah, they do crazy things like
that 3-hour achievement, man. Oh,
like
that 3-hour.
They actually do crazy things like, you know, baiting one of the jumpers, like the Frankies they call them, to like, you know, to places where they aren't even supposed to go and so on. Like they do absolutely insane things. But the idea was, first of all, as a token of appreciation, right? We wanted to make sure that the game is actually also built for speedrunners this time around, that we really focus on that as well. And we actually brought in one of the best speedrunners in the world as our QA guy to just constantly play the game and give us feedback and so on, because that just seemed logical to me, that it's like, hey, if you have these crazy fans out there that put so much time into that, well, let's just pay them, you know, let's make that their day job, you know. And that, I think, was a huge win for us, that we had Mike actually now doing all the, you know, testing and telling us, like, giving us feedback straight up whenever he plays a new build. That's really huge. And then, the idea with the whole, hey, let's give the player a whole bunch of skills was if you are into speedrunning, into like Legend of Zelda 1, for example, right? There's people who play through the entire game without ever using the sword. And there's something really enticing to me about that. I wanted people to be able to replay the game and actually have a very different experience the second time around or the third time around, simply because they used different items this time around, or they leveled in a completely different system, right? Where it's like, well, my first playthrough, I played with the Spirit Edge, which is this sword type weapon. What if my second playthrough, I really focus on spells, right? What if my third playthrough, I really focus on these projectile-based weapons and so on, and really level into that, right? So that every time you replay Will of the Wisps, that it will really feel a little bit different, right? Like that, you know, now because you committed to this different build, almost like, you know, playing Diablo 2 back then, right? That because I picked a different build, it would still feel fresh to me, you know, in terms of the gameplay, in terms of how I have to approach things and so on. That was the idea. And you don't constantly have to switch, even though we did create this spirit wheel, you know, little system. It's really easy to switch between stuff, but you will not find yourself like every scene or so that now I have to switch equipment. Oh, now I have to switch equipment again. But it's up to you, you know, like you can really adjust the game how you want to play it. If you're more into spells, if you're more into dealing with enemies through platforming moves and so on, you can do that. If you're more into, you know, using heavier weapons and so on, you can do that. If you're more into doing, you know, like playing sneaky and so on, you can play that way. That was the idea behind that.
Yeah.
I really want to play.
I was equipping everything because I just wanted to try them all, so I just kept changing everything that I was equipping because I wanted to see all the new stuff. It was really, really good.
That's one of the things that took me out of Breath of the Wild, was playing through. Oh, my weapon's broken.
Yeah.
Speaking of pet peeves,
you have no weapon breaking in
Yeah, good.
Speaking of pet peeves, I actually asked this of Adam Icegreen last time, but I'm actually curious what yours is, and the question is, what is your biggest game design pet peeve? Like design-wise, implementation-wise, in a game, in games you've played, what is the one thing that you hate the most?
That's a good question.
Gets out a really long list.
I mean, I'm a sucker for interactivity, you know, like really, like at Moon we have this notion of fun per inch, and that doesn't necessarily mean squeeze everything together as tight as possible, right? But it means I don't want to let go of the player, you know. I always want to have you exactly where I want you to be. Like that's the thing, like with film and so on, it's a very manipulative medium, right? And you really have to think about how the human brain works. So to me, one of the reasons, like Ori has a certain addictive quality almost to it, right? Where it's like you like, I even have that now when I playtest something, like, hey, I have to play this level that was just changed, and I play the level, and then I'm like, oh my God, I played 20 minutes now. What the hell happened? You know, that kind of thing. To us, like, it was super important. Oh, it's always super important to even vary the challenges, to do things like, hey, you have a platforming level, and then that's followed up by some enemy, and then that's followed up by a puzzle, and then that's followed up by some story thing, right? So it constantly varies the challenges, because if you'd have, oh, here's some difficult platforming, here's some even more difficult platforming, then here's more platforming. At some point, your brain tells you, I'm sort of getting bored of this, you know? Like, if Uncharted games and so on would only have the shooty stuff, right? And you wouldn't have these stories, the story things that break things up, I think the game would really suffer. So for me, in terms of like pet peeves, I would say things like QTEs, right? Or things where it's just, hey, this really takes the interactivity away from the player, you know, those kind of things where it's like, hey, we want to do a cool story sequence and this will take a long time now. Like, I would never design something like a Kojima game where it's like, hey, now watch this 30-minute cutscene or something like that, because
hey, man, really, hold on,
it's well, but that's just me, right? Like, I actually I like the Kojima stuff and so on, and I get that, and it's fine for people to do that, but just for me as a creator, I love constantly like getting my kicks, right? Like constantly having something that's like, okay, this is just designed for fun. This is also why, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Nintendo games and so on, and they design that same way, right? Where it's like, well, just fun. Is this fun yet, right? It's all about fun. And to me, like when suddenly the expectation is, it's almost like when I play a game, I have a certain expectation, and it's like, if you expect vanilla ice cream and suddenly you have mashed potatoes in your mouth, right? It's like, that's disgusting. So even though, you know, on their own, perfectly fine, right? Like, I like mashed potatoes, but if I sit down to play a game, I want to get my kick in terms of interactivity. And then if I stumble into, oh my God, now I have to watch this really long cutscene, that's where I kind of like zone out.
Yeah, and I think that is emblematic of some of the problems in that AAA industry today, in that for some reason, and I am completely on board the gameplay train, right, is that for some reason, a lot of games nowadays are expected to have these emotional story elements where they take you out and they show you something really serious. This is serious. Look at my game. You know, and it's like, there's a place for that, and I'm not taking anything away from studios that go that route, or indeed gamers that enjoy playing those kind of games. But I look at something like Crackdown 3, right? As a game, it is nothing like any of those kind of serious things. Is it a pretty fun? Is it constantly going, here's some shit to blow up because that's what this game is? Yes. So is it a bad game? No. Is it like, you know, the next Last of Us or whatever you want to call it? No, that's not what it's there for. And I hate that a lot of games nowadays are held up to standard A, this narrative, serious games are art, adventure, where it's like, that's never been what games are. Games are meant to be a blast to play through. And I get that people can get invested into storylines. Like, I'm one of the biggest Halo nerds going, and half that shit doesn't even make sense anymore. But, you know, there is a point where it's got to be about delivering that stuff via gameplay, not sit down, put your pad down. I mean, there's been I can't remember what game it was. There was a game on the Xbox 360 where I put the pad down and the cutscene went on for so long, my pad auto switched off. You are doing something wrong if that happens, because I'm not playing anymore, I'm watching a film, and that's not why I'm sitting there in front of a controller to play. So yeah, I completely get that.
I mean, look at. Sorry,
go ahead. I'm sorry. No, you go ahead.
Look at the prologue, right, for Blind Forest. I mean, we tell a story because we wanted to do a little setup, right, for like, hey, here's who you are, and here's the premise of the story. And even those small sections where you just have to walk and you're just experiencing that time, you know, that time lapse through Ori's, you know, like early life and so on. Just making those bits interactive, which was a huge pain in the ass to set up, like so painful. I mean, we worked on this sequence for like 8 months, I think, until it really worked. Hugely painful, but like having those because there's so much stuff that you have to think about, right? Like, oh my God, what if the player goes right at that point? Is the music long enough for that loop and all these things, right? But making that interactive, I think, was really a good thing. That it's like, no, you actually have to move, right? And then we threw in those things where it's like you play Ori, and you finally like Ori found these little fruits, right? And he brings them back to his mama, and then you see these little ghosts appear. And as you walk through back through that life that you've just seen, right? That you get these little ghostly moments. The interactivity of that you are the one who's walking and you are the one who's bringing the berries, I think is very different than if it would have just been, okay, put my controller away and you just see bit by bit and watch a cutscene.
Yeah.
So there's definitely something interesting there, right? I mean, I'm not shooting against games that do that. Like I like it when story cutscenes are in the game and they are good, right? Because again, like any good content is good, like you can make anything good, right? But if I sit down and play a game, like I want to play, and yeah.
I think like Halo, when Halo 2 did their remaster with Master Chief Collection, like even though Halo 2 personally, like the campaign isn't my favorite, watching those cutscenes like remastered in all their glory with cool graphics, and Halo Wars as well, for example, watching Spartans in their prime kicking ass and doing all that kind of stuff. As a fan, it was cool to do, but they never outstayed their welcome. They were sort of 3-minute vignettes of sorts where it was just like, here's some fan service and we're back in the game. And I think that's my limit when it becomes these sagas. Like I can't even imagine sitting down through Metal Gear Solid 4 or anything like that. Moon Studios as an entity is not in a single building. Am I right in thinking that? You guys are everywhere in different time zones, much like the arse of recording this podcast. Like, so do you have your guys working night shifts and day shifts to align like to a central thing? Like, how do you even manage that and produce something of really good quality as well? That must be tricky.
That's completely correct. I can give you, it's a very logical thing to do, and I'm actually surprised that not more studios are doing that. Because let me break it down for you, kind of like what our thought process was. So again, like when I was at Blizzard, one thing that we saw, like back then, Blizzard was just at the top of the world, right? And whenever we reached out to somebody, we saw on ZBrush Central some amazing artists, right? And you reach out to him, and your thinking would be, because like I was like that when Blizzard first reached out to me, I was like, and they were like, hey, do you want to work at Blizzard? Do you want to do a little test for us and then let's see? I was like, holy shit, like, yes, that would be amazing. Like I grew up with Blizzard games, let's do it. But if you talk to really talented people, a lot of times they're older, and they might have family and so on. And then suddenly you immediately get into those aspects of, I mean, I like Blizzard, but I don't want to live in Irvine, and my kid is in school, and my kid is more important to me than and ripping it out of school or her out of school would be really bad, right? So even though I like you guys, no, I don't want to do it, right? Like, and that really sucks. So we approached it with this idea of, hey, let's start an indie studio. And we knew a couple of people, but they were all scattered around the world, right? Like people that we wanted to work with that we thought would be a great addition to the studio. But one of the first guys that we hired was from Australia. So that really sucked for us because
the
we were from Europe.
Zone.
Worst time zone in the world. But we kind of made it work, in terms of like the time and so on. And that just naturally grew, right? We started hiring other people and so on. And it suddenly became like, it wasn't a thing that we had sat down and like, we're like, oh, this is our plan, like, and this is how we do it. But it became a tremendously successful tool for us to say, actually, we are a distributed studio. If we reach out to you, you can join the studio within a day. Like you just basically sign our contract and then you download our software that's called Apollo, where you log in with our credentials that we give you. It downloads our Munity engine. It downloads all the repositories and everything. And you set up within a day. And I can reach out to anybody. Like, and if I have that thing of like, hey, I reach out to this super talented artist or programmer or somebody, right? The discussion doesn't become, hey, I don't want to rip out my kids out of school and it will take me 8 months to do relocation and it'll take another 8 months to actually do the visa or any of that kind of crazy shit. We just basically have, hey, do you have a little home office, like a room that you could work with from home? And if you have that, cool, you're ready to go. And that actually allows us to hire some of the best people in the industry. Like the team at Moon, the whole idea was we want to work with the absolute craziest talent, with the most talented people in the industry. And that was one of the huge reasons why we were able to do that. Why we were able to poach people from Pixar, from Disney, from Riot, Blizzard, and so on, right? Simply because we can say, look, our games are small, we're working on super creative stuff. I mean, now the games that we're making aren't that small anymore, but back then it's like, hey, we're working on super creative stuff. It's not that factory thing where you work, like if you're working at EA and so on, where you're just a number, No, like in the studio, we have this whole thing of like every voice matters. So even if you're a QA person or whatever, right? Like I don't wanna say at all that hey, one job is more important than the other, simply because I truly deeply feel, well, a great idea can come from anywhere, right? At Blizzard, for example, if you're an artist and you have a great idea for some design, at least you think it's a great idea, the notion is really, well, shut the fuck up, because the designers are going to do that, right? And I always thought that's really silly, like why not, bring up all these, like if someone has a great idea, cool, then I don't have to worry about it, like then let's do it, if it really fits, if it really makes sense, then let's do it. And again, like a great idea can come from anywhere. If you're an artist and you just play the level and you have an idea for a design that would make it better, why in the world would I not listen? Like that's just so dumb. And I think there's a lot of ego when you're all working together, and like, people are afraid of like, hey, if that person has better ideas than I do, then maybe I'm losing my job and so on. And we don't have any of that office politics bullshit at Moon. Like really at Moon, you work with us, and as long as you contribute to the project and you pull your own weight and you're a cool dude to work with, that's fine, like that's exactly what we're looking for. I mean, most people at Moon have 10, 15 years of experience of working in the industry, so usually we expect them to be able to deliver. But yeah, that was the whole idea. Like we kind of like stumbled into that whole thing of like, hey, we just hire people from all around the world. I mean, by now we have 80 people from over 43 different countries, and we're super proud of that. Like I love the idea that we have people from Japan, from Europe, from Austria, Israel, South Africa, all of those places, like the US, tons of people from the US, especially our animators, a lot of them come from the US. Canada and so on, just from everywhere. Like they all come together to create something really special that all feels like it was made, like here's a team that is truly global, right? Where we don't care about, like any of those preconceived notions of like, hey, like, will this even work out and so on. And it's just like this multicultural team that comes together to work on something special, and everybody's really talented. And us pulling that off, I mean, it makes me proud, it's like, it really shows you that, it really shows you that it doesn't matter where someone lives or where someone comes from. If that person is passionate and talented, then great, you can work with us. I mean, and that's one of the beauties of the internet, right? That it's like, because that is one of the things that's really important for me, because I grew up in Austria, in Vienna, and when I told people when in my teens, right, that hey, I want to work in the video games industry, the general response was, you're fucking crazy. You will never make any money. You will end up like a bum on the street, right? Like you should do something wholesome, like become a cook or a mechanic or something like that. Right? Because the idea of like, oh, you work in this fancy thing, like you're just crazy, right? And then I actually studied traditional sculpture because I wanted to be an artist in the industry. And that was another thing where it's like, oh my God, you're fucking crazy. Like,
this isn't going to make you any money.
What sculptor do you know who actually, makes any money or makes a decent living and so on, right? And it's like, well, I really like that, well, I stuck it to everybody and was like, no, I'm gonna do that. And
now
it worked out. and now it really worked out. And I really love the idea that, well, we hire a lot of sculptors and painters and like jobs that didn't necessarily, or even our composer, right? Like classical music is something that hasn't been huge, for some time, but then it found its own niche in like film, in the film industry, and then also in games, right? And I love the idea that we can take these classical art forms and have people who are really passionate about that and put them together and actually really try to revolutionize those art forms again, right? And really, hopefully, like giving them better jobs than what they would have to do otherwise.
Yeah, I see that happening in my industry. I rewind 5-6 years, and it's like you're in the office at 8, you're stuck to your desk, you work till 5:30, you get out, and you come back the next day. Whereas the new job I have now, and I think part of that comes with as you grow in an industry, you get perhaps a little bit more leeway, a little bit more trust. But my job now is just do the work, man. It's cool.
That's
work from home, fine.
That I never understood that notion of, hey, in order for work to be work, you have to be stuck into this box of, well, first of all, you need to hate your job, right? Second of all, you need to come in at like, do an 8 to 5 job, and then hopefully you did something, right? But really the idea should be, at the end of the day, have you been productive? Did you create something? Did you do something that contributed some value, right? And I'm, for example, I'm the kind of person who works super hard. Like even now, like even though I have a kid and so on, I work my 14 to 16 hour days, simply because, well, I'm obsessed. I love the work that I'm doing. And I want our games and our stuff to be perfect, right? But at the same time, in order to be able to work these hours, I'm the kind of person who takes a power nap in the afternoon. I need that. I need a 30-minute nap or so in the afternoon to actually be able to work till like 2 a.m. or so. Because if I don't do that, I'm going to fall apart at like 11 p.m. or so. That 30-minute nap gives me power to go from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m., right?
Yeah.
I feel like generally like treating your sleep properly, like understanding how your sleep cycles work and so on, that's the best drug there is, right? Like,
I agree.
Only not into drugs, but honestly, if you really understand how to use your sleep, you will be so much more efficient than other people out there. And I actually brought that up at Blizzard back then, and I don't want to shit at Blizzard at all. They were a huge reason why I was able to do the thing that I'm able to do, and they were a great employer. But a lot of the more traditional studios, like I brought it up back then, like, hey guys, can I take an afternoon nap somewhere? And they're like, you want to sleep at work? Are you crazy? That kind of thing. But it's like, no, that's the wrong way to look at it, right? Yes, I want to take a nap at work so I can work even harder later on, and I don't run out of steam in the end, right? And that to me makes sense, which is why in the like when people have interviews with us for a job at Moon, like I immediately come out say, dude, I do not care at all about what hours you work. And if you want to take a nap, if you're the kind of person who gets refreshed from taking a walk in the afternoon to get some fresh air and so on, I really don't care. Like I really don't care if you have your kids and you have to spend some time with them and so on. Perfectly fine with me. The only thing I care about, it's a two-way street, right? Like you have to be able to contribute something, and as long as you do that, great. Like we don't have a problem. I couldn't care less about what your daily routine is or that kind of thing. Because at the end of the day, I want you to be the most efficient you that you could be. Yeah. And I don't get that if I put them into a box and just say, no, you have to work that way, like that.
Yeah. And well, speaking of the efficiency as well, the way your studio is set up, technically it would also allow you to be a 24-hour studio.
Yeah, it is.
Because of all the various time zones.
It is. Here's a funny thing. Like, I mean, we're doing some work still right now on the final dungeon for Ori, and I stopped working at 2:15 a.m. yesterday, and I had Chris and Milton and Michael, some of our other designers, actually just keep working, right? So now when I get into the office in the morning, I know because of our tools, like all of my stuff is updated, and I just open our engine and I see all the stuff that they did, right, while I was sleeping. And that is just really, really cool, like, and we can drop these notes there and say, hey, I worked on this scene and this scene, this stuff is still missing, can you do that, right? And seeing that stuff, like coming back, I just slept, oh, cool, all this stuff is there now. That's really neat.
Constantly updating builds, just like, oh, can I have that? Oh, this is in.
That's exactly. That's exactly what it's like. It's so neat to see. Oh, this stuff isn't set dressed yet. It's gray boxed. Then you come in the morning. And it's like, wow, that looks great.
Yeah. It's so I appreciate now that I might be diving into territory that you either can't talk about or can't even allude to. So you can just say no comment, to some of this stuff. I'd certainly not wanting to trap you into anything here. First question, we've got XO19 coming up. Dare I hope to see something Will of the Wispsy?
We're not talking about that today.
Okay, cool. Leave it there.
I can't say anything. Honestly, right now we're just focused on getting the game done. That's the highest priority item. I think honestly, like I look at this stuff always like a gamer would, right? Like because honestly, you guys have seen quite a few trailers of Will of the Wisps already. Do you need to see another one right now, right? I don't know, like really honestly, at the end of the day now, I think what people really want from us is just, hey, just give us the goddamn game and make sure it's great, right?
Yeah.
So right now, that's what we're focused on.
And the second question, go on, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I remember you mentioned quite a while ago in the Discord, because you're actually really active in the Discord, which is good. I remember you asked us the question about Game Pass, and you were having a chat with us about it because your Ori is a little bit different. Like, obviously, Microsoft has said all first-party games like Halo, Gears, all that sort of stuff straight into Game Pass, but I think at the time that wasn't necessarily the default for Ori. That was something that you guys sort of negotiated with Microsoft. Is that right?
That's completely correct. So I don't know if I would say Ori is first party, right? Because we are completely independent entity.
Right.
We haven't been bought by Microsoft or any of that. And I wouldn't honestly want to be a non-independent entity right now, no matter what people would pay. And yeah, when Microsoft first made that statement, we were like, holy shit, we probably have to talk because people will have certain expectations here.
Yeah.
And yeah, they approached us about Game Pass. And really, I mean, with Microsoft, we just sat down with them and had those negotiations and like discussed it. Obviously, like it's in our interest for Microsoft to be in a good shape, right? But also, like it also has to make sense business-wise and so on. So we just sat down with them and kind of like try to figure this out. And I mean, we'll have to see. Like to us, it's a scary thing, to be honest, Game Pass, because we don't know what that'll mean. You know, like
it's still so new. It's some people are saying it does great things. Other people are a bit tentative on it. Yeah.
Nobody, I think, has any idea right now. I mean, there are some numbers out there and so on, what effect it'll have. But nobody has any idea. Like nobody in the industry can tell you how will streaming affect games, and how will Game Pass ultimately affect games and so on. We just don't know. We took a gamble on this right now, and let's see. My hope is that a lot more people will try Ori, because similar to what you said before, right? What we saw is that even people who are not interested in platformers, I think because the game's quality is up there, a lot of people that tried it were like, hey, actually, I don't enjoy platformers much, but Ori was really fun, So to us, like we looked at it from that angle and we're like, well, look, I mean, at the end of the day, I want to have a lot of players. And I hope a lot of people enjoy Ori and then they're going to spread the word and so on. So really, like we looked at it from that side and just said, well, let's just do it, like hopefully millions of people end up playing Ori.
Yeah, because I imagine Microsoft must have the statistics and they share them with you in terms of, X people downloaded Ori, but this percentage of people stopped at the Ginso tree because that was their difficulty spike and they just never picked it up again.
Interesting thing is actually the people who got to the Ginso tree are usually the people who finish the game. the drop off was way before that, right? Like if people it was way before that. You like there's this idea out there, right, that the Shinzo tree was this super difficult spot where everybody stopped, and that's where it became way too difficult, and then people dropped off. That wasn't the drop off. The drop off happens much earlier because some people buy games and then they play them for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, and then they just see in that time, is that game for me or not, right? So the drop-off actually happens way, way, way earlier for a bunch of people. And then usually the people who got to the Shinzo tree, usually they finish the entire game.
Okay. That's interesting. That completely goes against what I would have naturally assumed.
Yes.
So fascinating.
That has been true for the studio as well, because we thought it in the same way, right? That, oh my God, there's lots of people who have trouble with the Shinzo tree, with that first escape sequence. But actually not true. If you look at the statistics, nope, most of the people who get to Shinzo tree and get to the escape sequence at some point do it and then actually finish the game.
They're already invested and they want to see it through.
The completion numbers for Blind Forest, I think also because it's not a ginormous game, right, where you spend 50 hours, the completion number is actually pretty high. I think it was something like 30%, which is unheard of, usually like 10, 15% or so of people who buy your game actually finish your game. And for Ori, the number was actually pretty high.
That's
Do the achievements make it easier to track that stuff?
We just have some telemetry and that kind of stuff. And also we see it on the achievements and, Microsoft data and so on.
Yeah. I mean, and you touched on it a second ago with Moon being independent. I mean, obviously, and being an active member on the Xbox Era Discord and in the main Xbox sort of safe space on Reset Era, you must, you're a smart guy. You're obviously acutely aware of what hardcore gamer nerds are like, and unfortunately for Microsoft, they've dug themselves a little bit, in my opinion, a bit of a grave here in making acquisitions part of their shows, because it becomes this weird war of who owns the most. I'm all for Microsoft finally actually saying, what's important to gaming games, great, and I like their messaging around making the studios that they do acquire having that autonomy, and we're not changing your culture like they would have gone and done back in perhaps the 360 days with Bungie and the like. There's been a lot of people saying, oh, of course, Moon Studios would be a great purchase, and I have to naturally assume that that's probably a conversation you've had, and I appreciate you probably can't talk about a lot of that, but you've been quite adamant, and you said it not 5 minutes ago, that Moon is absolutely happy being independent and wants to stay that way. Is that because as a creative industry, you guys like being in charge of your own destiny, so to speak? Is it more that you want to have those opportunities to take games that are yours and go, hey, we know we published this with you, but we really, that deal's expired. We want to be able to push it out on this platform so that more people can play your games. Is that the mindset behind it, more or less?
That's exactly right. So my thought process is simply, hey, I want to make creative stuff, right? I want to make stuff that I don't want to be stuck in this loop of making the same games over and over again, right? So generally, our relationship with Microsoft has been excellent. At the start, we were scared. Oh, we're partnering with this big publisher. We'll probably end up in the same thing, in the same place as other people, and they will just force us. Yeah, if something is successful, right, that you're just forced to make successful title 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and so on, and it keeps going, right? Like what happened to Halo and Bungie and so on. And that totally wasn't the case. Generally, every time we talk to Microsoft, it was always like, hey, what do you guys want to do? But the idea is, I want to keep that up. And as our stuff becomes more successful and the studio grows and so on, it becomes riskier, right? Simply because, now you have 80 mouths to feed. And that is actually it's a very simple calculation to make, but that is really expensive. That burn rate suddenly, of salaries that you have to pay every month, that is really, really expensive. But for us, the idea is, still we want to do this. Like I want to work on stuff that we feel super passionate about, because that's the only way I can guarantee quality. If I have to work on stuff that I'm not super motivated by, and I'm just doing it to collect my paycheck, and I'm just doing it because, well, it makes sense, for the studio, or because it's safe, then I don't know if I'd have the motivation to really pull through and say, I want this to be a 90-something Metacritic game that people love, and, like that kind of thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have a secret project in development, and I think that thing will become huge. So it would be tremendously stupid of us right now to even have these conversations, and then sell, for much, much less than what we could later on. But even honestly, my thought process right now is I just don't think we'll be in that spot. Like we are unbelievably lucky that we have this privilege to work on our own stuff, our own ideas, and are able to make that work, and are able to make a good business case for that. And why not keep going? Why even risk disruption for that, right? I think with Microsoft, I mean, all the studios they acquired, I think that has to end at some point, right? That they're just, okay, well, we're done with acquisitions for now. Let's actually see what those guys produce. And I think that they're probably going to be under a lot of pressure. Like they will have to show something. Like Scarlet is coming, right? And they obviously they're banking on, hey, those acquisitions that we made, they now have to produce something really cool. And I hope for them it works out that way, right? Because you never know. I mean, if you work with talent, you just never know what they might come up with, Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to me. I look back at some of the stuff that they've announced, and obviously the Microsoft of 2013, 2014 arguably is a very different Microsoft today. They from a consumer's perspective, they finally at least seem to understand what is important to be in the games industry. I think they completely lost their way in terms of churning out, we've ticked this box, here's the next thing, let's just let third parties take care of it. They need to be at the forefront. And Phil Spencer, I've met him, and obviously you've worked with him. He's a pretty stand-up guy from my impressions of the man, and he seems to be leading that sort of this is actually what games are about. I mean, we've spoken on this podcast before about how sometimes it doesn't always feel that the higher ups perhaps get what gamers are like in this way, and how ridiculously, and I'm not saying I'm this way, but generally they're super territorial. It's like team sports. My plastic box has got to win, and all this sort of stuff. Have you noticed that step change in terms of how they've approached, in terms of your working relationship with them, in terms of what they're like when they talk about gaming from 2013 to now? Have you felt that internally at Moon, or is it? Has it been that they've remained, pretty open and collaborative and chatty?
Well, so here's how it works from our side. Generally, we signed Ori during the Don Metric era, right? And back then, Microsoft had a lot of games in development all across the board. Like there was a time when Microsoft had like 30 internal games, and they just canceled games left and right. And for some reason, Ori always was on the side of, we can't cancel that. That's really good already. And I think that comes back to, well, we had a fun prototype at the start, and we just kept improving and improving. And as long as you show something that is fun, and you deliver on what you say you will deliver, then there's really no reason to cancel you, right? And it is really, really hard to make games. But we didn't have any contact with Don Metric or anything, right? Like we just basically talked to our producer, and we're like, dude, we're just trying to make a masterpiece here, let us do our thing. And that did change when Phil came in. Like I met Phil for the first time, I think at the award shows when Ori became a thing, like I think at TGA's 2015 or something, and talked to him at that point. And he is exactly like how you see him in those interviews and so on. I email with him quite a bit on things like, hey, dude, I have an idea for a controller for Scarlet, and just, hey, let's talk about it, that kind of thing. And he's very approachable, and I do think he plays those games, and he actually gets it from that point of view, which is super refreshing and which is super cool. I think usually your typical CEO in one of those, software companies and so on. Obviously, their day job is not playing games, right? Their day job is making sure, okay, all these mouths have to be fed, and how are we running the numbers? Is this all going to work, right? And I think it's refreshing that Phil is not. Yeah, I mean, he surely must be that, right? But he also is really passionate about games and really passionate about, like playing our builds and that kind of thing. And that's just cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's the whole you mentioned seeing Scarlet. Now I know you can't talk about it, but you've seen it, right?
No.
Do you have a dev kit? Are you allowed to say that?
I have nothing. I have no idea about Scarlet. No, honestly, I do not know anything about Scarlet at this point. I really don't. I don't have a dev kit. I don't have any of that. Honestly, also, I don't think it matters anymore. Like, we all know what Scarlet is, right? Like, we know the specs. We know what it'll be. It'll be a nice upgrade, and honestly, for a studio like ours, like, we don't care that much. Like, we will optimize the crap out of it, right? In whatever platform they give us. But yeah, we don't actually know that much yet. And Microsoft is historically like extremely secretive about any new project, about any new thing, right? Like, we, especially with the distributed nature of Moon, holy shit, is it difficult to send a dev kit to Russia when the thing's just not even out yet and so on. Like, all these problems that you're facing, or to Israel, like all these problems that you're facing with that, like, Microsoft is obviously really scared that, oh my God, what if this leaks and somebody makes photos of that, right, and puts it on the internet and so on. So
Russia's an interesting one. I've had clients with like GDPR concerns, and can I put my data in Russia? Is it allowed to come out of Russia? Like, how does that work? And I think my end, it was like, no. You can't. So yeah, I completely understand juggling some of that stuff must be super tricky. Now I'm not sure if you're aware, but we have a thing on XboxEra where we do Shpeshal Ed's top 5, and it's an interesting one this week because he's done,
especially after what you said earlier.
Yeah, he's done top 5 legacy Microsoft owned intellectual property that could
brought back
into the scene. Now, I read this because he published this earlier this week, and I read this and I was like, Nick, this is a fucking rare list. This is just rare.
Just rare. The whole list is rare.
What are you doing? Where's Freelancer, for fuck's sake?
No.
But
the whole thing is rare.
And if we've got a guest, we talk through perhaps IPs that Microsoft own that you think would be cool to come back. Ed, are you happy to go through your top 5?
Yeah. Well, I know Thomas is a busy man, so I'll try and get through this one quicker than usual. But word of warning: the whole list is just rare IPs.
It's like, what? This is just
I like I said, you guys know how much I love the Nintendo 64, so yeah, that was a really good period for Rare, obviously. So a lot of this stuff comes from there, but not all of it. So number 5, one thing I'd like to see come back is Kameo, which was one of the launch 360 games. Especially now, like, there's not a lot of games like that anymore. Like, I don't know what there is now. I mean, I know there's like Ukulele now, and there's, I guess, Ratchet and Clank, and not a whole lot else. Like, just those platform adventure kind of games. Kameo was
time. Like, that was like, you'd boot up your HD TV back in the day, glorious 720p resolution. You'd see the bump mapping and think, ooh, tessellation and stuff. Everything was really shiny, and you had all those. Were they orcs or ogres? They would come marching down the hill.
So many on screen too.
A ton of them, and you could turn into a plant and kind of.
I think one of the things to think about. Sorry, and I don't wanna interrupt your top 5 thing, but like one of the things that you should think about with that is, obviously Microsoft has to think about how does that fit into Game Pass, right?
Yeah.
Simply because, well, they made that statement. They came out there and said all our first-party titles are going to be on Game Pass. Well, so what does that mean, right? So you actually do have to think about, okay, how does that fit, right? Like, if the game's free, or basically almost free, right? Like you just pay your subscription fee and then you have it. How does it fit? I think Microsoft will probably take a dive on some of these games simply because, well, if you do a single player game and there are not that many microtransactions or stuff in there, then where's the money coming from? Like making games is really expensive and somehow you need to, make that money back so you can make the next game. There is a business aspect to it. So I think looking at your traditional single player games, and I'm with you there. I'm a huge fan of the output that Rare had on the N64. Like there were, Banjo Kazooie, Diddy Kong Racing, and so on. Holy shit, like really amazing games. But it's for some of these games, especially things like Kameo, it's really hard to see making a business case for that on something like with Game Pass.
Yeah. It's interesting because that argument's been had, right? In that, is Game Pass going to lead to arguably, PlayStation diverging one way into this single player territory and Microsoft diverging into another with a lot of multiplayer games. And a lot of people for Ninja Theory, when their first game after Hellblade, which was a single player experience being announced, was Bleeding Edge. Everyone was like, see what they're doing, even though Bleeding Edge existed years before the Microsoft acquisition. Part of me wants to hope that games that are niche that wouldn't exist are able to exist because of Game Pass. Like that's my personal hope. But I've seen a lot of people on Reset Era talking about the death of single player games because of services like Game Pass, because what's the point in making a 50-60 hour RPG experience if there's no way to monetize it?
The thing is, you have to have variety, right? Like you have to have a platform that is not just that. Yeah, exactly. It's not just that, right? Because at some point, like as a consumer, I'm like, okay, well, I don't want to play those Game Pass things or turn on my Xbox because it's just that kind of stuff, right? I think Sony has a bit of that problem as well, right? With like, hey, every Sony game is the same thing, right? Like Call of War is now Uncharted, right? That kind of thing. And like Microsoft definitely has to. And I think like listening to what Matt Booty and so on have been saying, right? I do think they're aware. I mean, they just bought Double Fine, right? So they must be aware that they will have to make some investments that just benefit the platform as a whole, and not just necessarily, hey, we made that game so that it could make all the money in the world, right? Yeah. But more like, no, actually, we might not make a crazy amount of money here, but it benefits Game Pass.
That's right.
Similar to what Sony did back then with like things like Journey and Flower and so on. They probably weren't games that made Uncharted money, but I mean, I bought a PlayStation 3 back then because I wanted to play Flower, and those kind of games. And I think Microsoft, like, I really, really hope that they are completely fully aware that actually you need a good variety of stuff to keep people interested.
Well, I mean, Ori is single player.
Yeah. I mean, Ori, like if you would pitch it, right, and you would just look at it from the Game Pass perspective, it would be a horrible failure, right? Like there's no microtransactions in there, there's nothing. It's literally your typical single player Nintendo-ish game, right? There's no way this would make financial sense. But there's many people, and we know that there's many people, or back then, like there were many people, we had like bundles, there were 800,000 Xbox One bundles made with Ori and they all sold out, right? And there's many people who bought an Xbox because they wanted to play a 2D platformer again, right? They really liked Ori and they bought it. And that's cool. I mean, similar to how many people bought PlayStation 3s back then because of Flower and Journey and those kind of things. So yeah, there's
you do.
Definitely that.
You want to get people subscribing, so it's in their best interest to have a lot of different stuff on there to let people know that no, you're not going to get just one type of game on the service. You're going to get a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fine to have Sea of Thieves, and those kind of things. But at the same time, you also need, okay, but I want to play my 2D platformer now. Oh, I want to play this. Or I want to play that, right? And if there's nothing like that on that service, then I don't know if I would stay subscribed for all that long.
That's right.
Yeah. Quite true. I liked it. But Kameo was good. I enjoyed Kameo.
Yeah, that was gross. So number 4, This one was on the Nintendo 64, Jet Force Gemini.
God, that is a blast from the past.
Oh, look, the game, to be honest, the game doesn't hold up great. But
it really doesn't.
It doesn't hold up great, but I have this vision of Jet Force Gemini coming back as like a Ratchet and Clank clone. Like, if you think of how Ratchet and Clank plays and everything like that, I reckon Jet Force Gemini could work really, really well like that if it was brought back. But I don't know what the chances are of that. I don't see Rare going back to the well with a lot of their IPs, but I'm hoping that, kind of like with Battletoads and with Killer Instinct, they can find studios to bring them back on Rare's behalf.
That's the difficult question, right? Who would actually make those games? It's really hard for publishers right now to find developers who make super high quality experiences. It's really, really, really hard. Like, how many studios do you know off the top of your head that could tackle a Kameo or a Jet Force Gemini or something like that? It's really, really hard, Like,
well, Sony just took one of them.
Yeah, that's the thing though. Like, I wanted to bring that up before, right? Like with Insomniac, with the whole buyout. I mean, I would guess that Insomniac is aware that they will work on Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man 3, Spider-Man 4, and so on, right? And yeah, I personally am not a huge fan of that, of that idea, but.
I think Sony will allow some flexibility there. Like, I think they've actually said they're still allowed to do Ratchet and Clank, and they're a pretty big studio as well, Insomniac, so they can probably get something done.
Be interesting.
For sure. I mean, also Ted Price is a super nice guy, right? Super smart as well. And yeah, I'm sure, like, if they, like, of course they will do that, right? But of course they will also do Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3.
Yeah, of course. Like the flip-flop between the two. I mean, I think when that happened, we discussed on this podcast, I can't remember, Cairo, if it was you or if it was you, Ed, that said, it wouldn't surprise any of us that Microsoft, obviously, who was shopping around, knocked on their door and went, "Hey, how you doing? Here's some money." And Insomniac, who's obviously legacy Sony in terms of their relationship, went, "Look, we've had an offer we can't refuse. You want to talk?" It wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't, but yeah. Anyway, well, I digress.
Now, number 3. This goes back to what you mentioned earlier, Thomas. My number 3 is Banjo-Kazooie.
I think Banjo-Kazooie, honestly, it's actually really underrated. I recently played it again. I honestly believe, the first one. So here's the thing. I love Banjo-Kazooie. I hate Banjo-Tooie. Simply because if you look at those games, Banjo-Kazooie, like, obviously it was a huge critical and commercial success, right? Yeah. But honestly, I think you could make a good argument that it was actually better at what it did than Super Mario 64 was.
He said it.
So I love Super Mario 64 as well, right? I still every now and then like throw it in, play it, and so on. But purely in terms of like them crafting a 3D platformer, that thing was insane. Like, that was really, really good. The level design was super tight. It's just a super fun game to play. Banjo-Tooie was a piece of shit. Like, that was just, let's take the same thing. Let's make the levels unbelievably huge. And it's just, good, guys. I'm just a gamer, right? Like, I look at it also from that perspective. And it's such a game, compared to.
I agree.
To the masterpiece that is Banjo-Kazooie. Like, I think back then though there was this notion of bigger is better, right? If you look at games like Unreal back then, right? Like, to me, something like Unreal Tournament was this super tight arena shooter, right? And then Halo came out, and suddenly they had to turn Unreal, which was just designed as a super tight arena shooter, into now we'll support vehicles and huge worlds and so on. And it's a similar thing to Banjo-Kazooie going to Banjo-Tooie, right? Where the idea was, now the hardware is there and we can make bigger worlds, or the software is there and we can make bigger worlds, and everything, like, big is good, right? And I think especially with indie games and so on now, like, no, it really highly depends on the level design and like the quality of it, and not just, if it's bigger, it's better. That's mostly why I don't like Banjo-Tooie, simply because well, they didn't change the mechanics all that much to actually make sure that those huge levels work. And I think you see the same problem in Yooka-Laylee, right? Where it's like, why are these goddamn levels so huge, And like, it's not
Bigger
like the
is not
moment-to-moment
always better.
gameplay. The moment-to-moment gameplay just isn't really there, and that's something that is hugely important for a platformer like that, where it's like, yeah, if you look at the levels, how they designed it for Banjo-Kazooie, maybe they designed them like that because they were just limited in terms of hardware, right? But also that really helped making the game feel super tight. And once they actually removed that limitation, they made it bigger, but to a fault, right? And that like, I would love to see something like a Banjo 3, but done in the style of the first Banjo-Kazooie, where you don't just use hardware and say, let's make this an open world game, right? That's crap. No, it would have to be done in the way that Banjo-Kazooie was done, where it's just, no, let's make a huge number of levels with insane variety, where there's just tons and tons of cool moves and cool stuff for you to do and so on.
That link into each other really well.
And link into each other really, really well, right? And just kind of like, again, like keep that, constantly keep you addicted to it, because there's always new stuff that's happening, and it's so quick to go in and play through that level, and finding all the notes is fun and satisfying and so on.
Yeah.
But again, like, you have this problem of, well, what developer would actually make Banjo 3? Who's out there who could actually do that? It's really, really difficult. It's hard.
Sounds like maybe Moon could.
Yeah, I mean,
you're just fishing right now, aren't you, Nick?
No, I mean, I'll be completely honest. Like, we actually had a couple of those discussions internally, because the guy we hired from Raymond, Chris McEntee, is also a huge fan of just platformers and so on. Like, he really helped on Ori on a lot of that stuff. He's a designer who has that same brain as I do in terms of like how to design games, and he really loves platformers and so on, right? So, and we did have those discussions like, hey, wouldn't it be really cool if at E3 Phil would go on stage and like you would see a Banjo 3 thing, and it's like it brings up Moon Studios, that kind of thing. I think people really love that, but I mean, at the same time, as a business, we have to see where we will be heading. But yeah,
it's interesting, and it
came up before.
Yeah, it speaks back to something we mentioned earlier when we said, sometimes it doesn't always feel that Microsoft get what they could do on some of the big shows like E3. And we've spoken before about how easy it would. Do you remember the Sony E3 of dreams, where they were like Final Fantasy 7, Shenmue 3, and all this sort of stuff, even though it was like 5 years away. Yeah. But the conversation that they garnered by doing that, by nodding back to the past and going, here you go, people that have been waiting desperately for this, go and talk and advertise for us. It's such a simple thing. And you can't imagine, really, if we're talking to the scale of a Banjo-Kazooie, that it would be a crazy investment for Microsoft to make, even if it didn't sell gangbusters. Now that they've got Game Pass, there's no excuse not to revisit some of those fan favorites, so to speak. So
I mean, I'm sure they have those discussions. It's just really hard to find a developer you would give it to who could deliver on that vision, right? I think with the E3 stuff, I mean, I like that Microsoft is honest about E3, right? Where they're like, okay, let's not show a game that'll be 3 years or 4 years in production at that point. That kind of thing. But it's like Sony, and I say it in a way that is super controversial, right? But Sony, sometimes similar to Apple, is good at bullshitting, right? Where it's like, hey, let's show all this crazy shit, right? And it's like, yeah, well, that's gonna take forever to come out, and you have a trailer or something, right? And you have nothing in terms of development yet, but it gets people excited, and but there is an honesty that Microsoft has there, where they're like, no, actually, let's show the stuff that is actually closer to release, and yeah, you don't get that same excitement maybe from that, right? Because people, like, especially in the games industry, like, people want to get hyped up. They want to get all this, like, oh my God, that was amazing. And people, jump on the desk and they're like, yeah, holy shit. But you have to appreciate that, well, at least they're being honest about it, right? Like, at least there's this honesty of like, well, we could also show trailers, but like what does that help if the game is not out for another 3 to 4 years?
Yeah, they did that, didn't they? And then it obviously came back and bit them in the behind. I mean, even to this day, when they revealed Fable 4,
Legends,
and I looked at it, Legends, and I played through it I was in the beta. One of my cousins, funnily enough, was a developer at Lionhead when they got shuttered. And I said to him, like, dude, I appreciate, thanks for letting me in the beta, but who is this game for? Because this game, I don't know why this exists. This is nothing like any Fable fan would ever want to see ever. Why are you making it? Like, no offense, it looks pretty, and I'm sure in the genre of 4v1 games it might be great, but right now this should not be. You should just use the art and go make a Fable if you're going to make
Fable game. Yeah. So Fable is actually really interesting to me as an IP, because back then on the Xbox One, I loved Fable 1. Obviously, it had tons of issues, right? But there was just something really satisfying about the game. I also really liked the art style back then and so on. There was really something satisfying about that game. And then Fable 2, to me, was one of the most disappointing sequels I ever played. Like, that just didn't have that same feel anymore. And it had that stupid trail, like where it's like, oh, we think you're stupid, so just follow that thing. and then Fable 3 completely tanked, right? And then all of that went to garbage. I don't know anything about what Microsoft is doing with Fable, but hope. I love Fable 1, and I think that could be something. It's just, again, like, hey, who's going to do it? And if the rumors are true that Playground is going to do it, then cool. But I would love to see something similar to Banjo Kazooie, where I would love to see something where it's more closer to the original game and not like the stuff they had before.
Did you play Nuts and Bolts?
I did. But again, like, I think Nuts and Bolts is this kind of thing where they wanted to make a game, and I don't know if the game that they wanted to make really was Banjo Kazooie, right? Like, I think that could have been probably more successful. That probably could have been more successful if it would have been a different game. But again, like, it's the same problem again, right? With, like, I expect vanilla ice cream, and suddenly you stuff mashed potatoes in my mouth, right? Which is like, if I want to play a Banjo game, I have a certain expectation, And then getting Nuts and Bolts was just, well, that's not Banjo to me, Like, it was a really fun game, but really, like, especially with the first trailer that they've shown back then, right? Like, everybody just expected a normal platformer, and it wasn't that.
That analogy of vanilla ice cream to mashed potatoes, the biggest game for me, now I think of it, is Brutal Legend. I went in expecting a really fucking awesome heavy metal influence, which is one of my favorite genres, hack and slash with a load of legends. And then I got 45 minutes, an hour in. It's an RTS game. I was like, no.
that was stupid marketing on Activision's side, though, right? Because like there is, like, if you actually research that a little bit, there is this really interesting thing that happened with Activision where they were like, guys, RTSs don't sell. That's crazy. We're not going to mention RTSs in marketing even once, right? It's crazy, and it's like that's so dumb. Like, that's what the game is. You should advertise what the game is. If it's good at what it's doing, then you should have to. And then, but there's nothing worse than getting into a game and then getting something completely different, right? Like, it's just, well, I was in the mood for a certain thing, and then you just gave me something different, right? I think that's also, to a certain degree, that's also what happened to Metal Gear 2 back then, right? Where it's like, hey, you played Metal Gear 2, and the ship section was amazing, right? And then you got to, who is that guy? I don't want to play as that guy. But yeah, I mean, the Brutal Legend thing is definitely interesting. That I think that was more of a fault from Activision just marketing the game in a bad way.
They clearly knew that it wouldn't sell if it was revealed to be that
an RTS game.
Which is crazy. So now I feel like I've been tricked. It makes me hate Activision even more than I already do.
Was it Activision or was it EA?
No,
I think it was Activision at the start. Like, it went through so many publishers at some point.
Probably because they all suddenly realised it was a RTS. But the same thing happened to them. They were playing through and were like, wait.
Yeah, I don't know who their final publisher was anymore, but yeah. That story is really interesting to research.
It was originally published by Sierra and then was bought by Activision, and then it came from Electronic Arts. So you were right, Nick.
So it was EA. Okay, well there you go.
There you go. So they did do a bit of a rigmarole. Anyway, Massive tangent. Sorry. Number two.
Viva Piñata.
Yeah, I think actually Viva Piñata was way ahead of its time, right?
Yeah,
like if you look at it now, if you look at that space now and like, hey, you make your own little garden and so on, that would work nowadays so well, and it's crazy to me that they didn't go back to that.
Yeah.
Because also like
perfect as a mobile game now. But even cross, like, don't worry about mobile, cross-platform, Xbox, Switch, mobile, iPad, and have it all cross-progression, cross-save, cross-platform. It would be huge, I reckon.
I fully agree. And I mean, you still have all those developers that worked on Viva Piñata at Rare, right? Like, I think those people are still there. So yeah, it's really strange to me that they didn't go back to that, especially with like, now everybody is online and like microtransactions and all this stuff, right? And it's like, no, you could turn this into something really big. Like, I mean, that's one of the things where you really have to commend Nintendo on how they push things like Animal Crossing, right? Which is such a weird thing. Like when it first was announced, right? It's like, wow, as Animal Force, like this is super weird, and like, would this even work? But then they pushed it, right? And now it's like, oh, it's a huge franchise, right? And I think Microsoft is lacking that a little bit, right? Because they could have, I think, turned Viva Piñata into something huge.
They tried. They had the cartoon series, didn't they?
They
had the cartoon series that launched with it. And I remember seeing a couple of episodes and thinking, that's cute. And I loved the game. And my partner at the time loved the game.
Really good.
And part of me thinks like, God, just, I know it's backwards compatible, but, give it a little bit more prominence, or maybe revisit it and just, do a remaster where they really just release it onto Game Pass, but it has that connectivity, it has a mobile version, whatever, and just make bring that IP back into that mind.
Like, I know everyone hates microtransactions, all that sort of stuff, but I still think Viva Piñata is one of those exceptions where it would fit. Like, you buy a different outfit for your animals, and you buy some candy, and you trade animals with people on mobile, and you so many applications.
So clever.
Especially, I mean, how perfect would this be for Game Pass, right? Just perfect. Like, why is that? Like, I hope it's in development. Like, if it's not, that's
well, Rare are working on another IP. We just don't know what it is, and I presume it's new, but we just don't know. We just don't know. We will find out next year, I guess.
I've always seen Viva. Like, I understand that Nintendo 64 is probably widely considered Rare's golden era, but I put Viva Piñata right up there with anything they did on the Nintendo 64, on the Super Nintendo. Like, that's the one thing they did for Microsoft that's right up there.
I would completely agree with that. The Microsoft era Rare, I definitely think Viva Piñata was really showing, no, they're still an incredible developer. They're still an incredible developer if you let them work on stuff like that, and even though, it wasn't everything it probably was cracked up to be, in the first iteration or so, right? Well, just keep going, like Nintendo did with Animal Crossing. Just keep going. There is something really interesting there. You just have to find the right formula and exploit it. And maybe it could become huge. Maybe it could become that kind of game that then becomes, what Animal Crossing is to Nintendo now, Viva Piñata could easily be for Microsoft.
Yeah. And I Rare, I still think, everyone knows on this podcast by now that I am a massive, massive Sea of Thieves fan. I still think that has got so much Rare magic in it, stupid, goofy moments, and the fact that they focused from a development or a design perspective all about stories and things that happen with your friends. I still think that game, more than anything else I've played this entire generation, has given me more hilarious, silly, crazy moments that I've been able to enjoy with pals in a co-op environment that will stay in my memory way longer than anything else that I've played from a multiplayer perspective. There's just been so many cool little moments, like there's Tall Tales stuff that they introduced, full of Rare charm in terms of its storytelling, but because it's shared world, because there are other players, we were doing like a section of 3 of them. I had 3 mates in here in this office, and we were LANing it and playing together on my connection, and we had this other crew on a galleon that were chasing us all the way through our adventure, and they felt like the villain of our story. Like they were the enemy pirates trying to thwart us. So many amazing like confrontations where we were like running with the chests and it was just brilliant. I've never played a game like it, and I know a lot of people it's like Marmite, but I still absolutely believe
have you guys ever played Sid Meier's Pirates?
Yeah,
no,
man.
No, I have not.
Brilliant.
So that actually, I mean, as a concept, right? Sea of Thieves. I mean, that thing is just really exciting. Like that nobody turns something like Sid Meier's Pirates into a big online, thing. And Sea of Thieves is kind of heading into that direction, right? But yeah, there was huge potential there to actually turn it into a big multiplayer thing.
I've said it before in this podcast. I actually ended up semi seriously applying to Rare for a game design position because they put a post up saying, don't care if you've never worked in the industry, we want to hear your ideas. Cynically, part of me thinks now, because they implemented a bunch of the ones that I wrote down, and obviously lots of people are going to have similar ideas if they're fans of the game, but part of me thought, you're just collecting ideas to see what your community wants, you jerks. But I actually wrote like an 8-page design document of stuff they want to do. Sometimes I feel that their obsession with letting players create stories together is preventing them from doing what a lot of gamers want, which is to really lean into the more MMO aspects of having, a port harbor sort of thing where there is no combat, but you can play gambling games with other pirates, and there's like 100 people there, and having snow biomes and more players per ship, per instance, I should say. It feels like they're still trying to control how the interactions work, whereas I personally feel that they should just open it up. But I'm not in charge, so we'll see what happens.
I mean, I think there's generally a huge lack of games that are just worlds where you can feel home.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing that I'm also really passionate about. But it's not just about shoot these aliens, or destroy those things or combat and so on. Like, why don't we have that many? Well, like Minecraft has become such a huge success, right? And Minecraft is literally can be the calmest game ever,
Yep.
right? But it's just, hey, you're just building stuff together, and it's fun. It's Lego, right?
Yeah.
And there hasn't actually been that, even though that was a huge success, and there have been clones, right, that just try to do the exact same thing. But there haven't been that many experiences where it's really just, hey, let's build stuff together. Let's have fun, and it's not about shooting and it's not about crazy challenge. It's just about, hey, let's be creative, right? And I mean,
yeah.
I don't mean in the sense of Little Big Planet, right? I mean in the sense of like a Sea of Thieves, right? Where it's like, hey, you could actually build your own town, and everybody lives there, and you just go online on your Xbox and you just see all those, people there and so on. There is something truly enticing about that whole concept.
Yeah, well, Atlas from the guys that did Ark, and I think Gareth Coker did the music for Ark as well, and I presume they might have re-engaged him for Atlas. He's leaning more into what I want Sea of Thieves to become, but unfortunately it's full of jank and it makes me not want to play it. So, you get that really nice rare polish, and I like the cartoony kind of feel. It's a little bit more homely, whereas Atlas just seems like, loads of cool ideas, but it's just a hodgepodge of mechanics to try and tick a bunch of boxes. It just doesn't quite work for me.
To be fair, Sea of Thieves is a lot of moments of brilliant ingenuity that you can't really get anywhere else. But at the same time, the combat is ass.
Oh yeah, I totally think that they really need to
melee combat is absolutely atrocious.
The thing is, the world is so charming. You're like, the combat isn't the point. The ship combat. If you take away the sword,
you're either on the ship. You're either on the ship or engaging people one-on-one. I mean,
as soon as you're not,
I think actually isn't the same completely true for the Elder Scrolls series. Like, you have Skyrim, right, which is like, okay, the combat is terrible, especially if you played games like Dark Souls and so on before, where it's like, this is how you can do melee combat and have it be fun, right? But it's like Skyrim has so many other things going for it, and that became like they sold 30 million copies of that. I think there is that, right, of like, well, it's just, there are other aspects that make it fun, and Sea of Thieves definitely has a bit of that. But I think Sea of Thieves, just like a game like that, has to be massive to really fulfill its full potential. And I hope Microsoft will keep going on it, right, and just keep improving. With these kind of games, honestly, I really hope that we kind of get into a space where it's not about making another sequel and making another sequel. And I think also Bungie with Destiny tapped into that, right? Where it's like, the last thing I want to see is Sea of Thieves 2 or Sea of Thieves 3, right? It should just, you created a platform, keep going, keep perfecting it. Because the nice thing that will happen at some point, right, is that if it at some point works in a really big way, at that point, you're so far ahead of the competition that nobody can copy your stuff, right? Similar to what happened with Blizzard and World of Warcraft, right? Where it's like, well, once this worked, it's like, well, Blizzard is years ahead of you, and good luck making another MMORPG that delivers all that content and so on, right? And I really hope we see more of that, like this whole that we see games that basically are a platform where it doesn't just become, actually we need to do a sequel, so let's change the combat system a bit, let's make the UI different and so on. Now we can sell it as game 2, right? But then it's more like, no, actually, let's keep perfecting that package, right? Let's keep going and going, and then just craft this perfect experience. That I think is also really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think that works massively for multiplayer games in particular, or games where you're connected with other people. You know, I don't think you could do that with a Halo campaign, because you know the dev time is so long, and then you have those campaign nerds that just want that amazing narrative experience. But for the Halo multiplayer story, I've often argued that they should really do what they did with CS:GO, which is like, here's Halo. We will continue to iterate the fuck out of it until it is this polished gem. We won't rewrite the board and try and chuck in a load of new abilities every 3 to 5 years. And I miss the days.
Remove all the multiplayer maps that you all love, right? And throw a bunch of other shit in there.
Except we've changed the scale because we've introduced jetpacks, or we've introduced this, and suddenly the maps that were perfect don't work anymore because the player movements do. It irritates me no end, because I miss the days, and this is part of me, being younger and not having kids or a wife or a job that I cared about to manage. Is that you turn on your machine or your PC or your console, and you'd have that one game that everyone was playing because it hit at the right moment. So there's a bit of nostalgia there, and I want to see that come back. And for me, the last sort of year and a half has been Sea of Thieves. Like, I had a really dedicated crew, but even we burned out on that game. We played it so much, and a lot of it was just grind to get boxes ticked and commendations done, but we had so much fun.
It needs more content. It needs more stuff that keeps you enticed, like different aspects of it, right? So that it's not just always the same gameplay loop, because that's where your brain actually shuts off and is like, do we really want to do that again and again and again?
Yeah, because the quests are there to fuel hilarious stories, but the problem is that they all effectively become, go here, either dig this, read that, do this, come back, and it needs to be more than that. And they've added a bunch of cool things that I really enjoyed seeing, but I've still said to this day that Rare, if they really want to put Sea of Thieves on the map as a multiplayer experience, they did Arena, but it's this really concise arena style experience. You've got a huge open world, throw 20 ships in with crews of 4, you've got the red mist that shrinks and limits it, you've got storms, have a fucking proper battle royale, because the naval combat in that game is where the game excels. That would be great.
I just watched a GDC talk from the guys who did Don't Starve, and that is actually really interesting. You guys should watch that, because they because they suddenly like had this whole thing where it's like, hey, we made Shank and Mark of the Ninja. Let's go completely fucking insane. Let's do something completely different, where our whole development methodology has to be different, right? And it's a similar thing where they started out making the game, and then they just put it out on the Chrome Web Store and didn't want to have a lot of players because they still wanted to refine and polish and so on. And there's something really, truly interesting about that, right? Like that you could just keep going and keep going. And I think with Sea of Thieves, it's that, right? I think it's also really smart of Microsoft when they bought Minecraft back then, that they didn't immediately go and say, oh, let's turn it off on all the other devices so that people who want to play Minecraft have to buy an Xbox. I think that would have killed the game. That they just said, hey, we're going to just keep improving Minecraft. We're going to add more stuff. We're going to add more content. We're going to keep improving it. We're going to enable crossplay on all devices and so on. And now it's the biggest thing in the world, basically, right? And that's good. And that kind of idea that, hey, you can play everywhere on all devices, and it's a platform. I think most, like a lot of games that are really huge right now, look at Fortnite, right? Are basically that, where it's like, it's a platform, we just keep perfecting it, you like it, you get your kick out of it, and we just keep on perfecting it all the time, right? Frankly, that's also what Blizzard used to do, right? With Diablo, Diablo 2. They just kept going and like made more expansions and just made that package really cool until nobody else was really able to deliver that same package and that same content because, well, there's years and years and years of development and polish and balancing that went into that you just won't be able to match if you just start fresh.
It's funny. I actually wish they'd do that with sports games. Just make them a platform and then you update it each year.
Yeah. But then
most
you look at
most of those games
studios like EA with FIFA, they must make so much money.
Yeah,
but,
I know.
There's no, we won't do that because idiots will keep buying the same shit with a different number.
Yeah, it's like where does our $60 come from? That kind of thing. But like as a player, obviously it would be better if you just, hey, I have my FIFA subscription, right? And it just keeps going.
Yeah. I really fucking hated it when Bungie did that with Destiny 2. Destiny should have never had a sequel. Destiny 1 should have still been the fucking game that lasted for years.
I completely couldn't agree more.
And it's like it's funny too because you look back and you see like hints of them going like, yeah, this is going to be a 10-year game. We're planning on just sticking with this and updating it forever. And then Activision's like, wait, hold on, we need a sequel here for another $60 every 3 years.
We need our money.
That definitely came from the business aspect, but I think Bungie is at a place, right, where it's like,
oh yeah,
guys, there's not going to be a Destiny 3 now. Like Destiny 2 is it, right? We're gonna keep improving.
We're at a place now where Bungie has basically all but come out and outright said, there's probably going to be a year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7. We're just going to keep fucking going until some people stop playing this fucking game. So.
And I think that's good. I think that's interesting. Like they should keep doing that because it's a silly tradition now, right? That it's just all tied to business, Like, hey, you need to make a sequel because you need your $60. Somebody needs to fund the game, right? And we do need to find ways of saying, no, people, who love the platform will invest into the platform and keep going, right? And the developers don't have to go through stupid shit like, oh, we need to make a new UI. Even though the one we have is perfectly adequate, simply because it has to be a sequel and it has to look a little different so that people don't just say, oh, it's Destiny 1.5 or something like that.
Yeah, basically. And it's funny, too, because you see, like, when Destiny relaunched on Steam with the free-to-play model, it skyrocketed to one of the most popular games on Steam and on PC in general. And it's been, last I checked, it was still there, still in the top 10 most played games on PC. So and has just remained there since.
It's not surprising. Look at things like Dota and Counter-Strike and so on, right? That has been going on for a long, long time.
People will play quality
games. PC. If that's the popularity on PC, imagine what the popularity on consoles is. It's insane. How big those games can be if they just actually like dedicate the time to committing to a user base and saying, no, we're just going to keep updating what we currently have because everyone seems to like it. And we'll stop when people stop playing.
I mean, that's the tricky thing, though. And Rare have said that in terms of, how do you... Creating games is hard. Creating content that works is hard without bugs. You're working with a live platform. You introduce something, it breaks something over here that you didn't foresee. And they've been quite open with, they tried to do these big things, and then they did their big anniversary update, and then they stopped doing anything for like 3 or 4 months, and everyone was like, what's going on? And then they've said, right, okay, we've been working behind the scenes, and now we've got a monthly cadence where we introduce these new mechanics, and they have their insider program. So you see more and more developers really leaning into, listen to the audience. These people really like this game. What can we give them that is not working our staff to death, like perhaps the Fortnite team have to do on a regular basis now because it makes so much money, but that is fair for us, fair for them. Everyone's going to enjoy themselves, but at the same time, part of me always wants to see that big step change. And there's got to be that extra team that's working on the bigger behind the scenes to really surprise and delight. But we'll see.
Yeah, keep in mind there are games where that doesn't fit, right? I'm all the while you guys are talking, I'm thinking about how in the world would you have ever done that for Ori, right? And it doesn't work. Like with Ori, no, you need a fresh start. You need something where it's like, no, this is the new experience. So there's always going to be both, right? There's going to be games that actually work as a platform, and there's games where it's like, no, this actually needs a new chapter, basically.
Yeah.
After
all that,
big tangent.
Yeah, Viva Piñata led to all sorts of things.
Yeah, there you go. Good. Number one.
Speaking of some games needing something new and not being a platform, the number one IP I'd like to see them bring back, and it is rumored to be coming back, is Perfect Dark.
That's rumblings.
Yeah, it's rumored, but how true those rumors are, who knows? But I think with Perfect Dark, if it were to come back, it shouldn't and probably wouldn't come back as a first-person shooter. I wouldn't mind seeing that?
Because you've got Halo.
Perfect Dark. Yeah, well, you've got Halo. That's their premier thing, and I just think there's a lot of first-person shooters out there. I see Perfect Dark coming back more as like a stealth-based third-person action game, almost like a Splinter Cell.
But do you realize what you're doing right now? Like, you're basically pitching mashed potatoes to me, you know?
Yeah, I know.
Because it's
easy though.
If people like you already saw where, like, I think Goldeneye was huge, right? And then Perfect Dark came in and they just improved that formula, or tried to. Yeah. And that was interesting. I think if Perfect Dark comes out and you pitch it as like a third-person sneaky thing, I think there would be a lot of people who are like, why is this Perfect Dark? You know, this is not the thing that I was expecting, you know, that kind of problem. And I think it would be really hard, honestly, like as a developer, if you would actually need to sit down right now and do a pitch for Perfect Dark 3, I think it would be really, really, really difficult to turn that into something new, right? Because now suddenly, like, you have to look at, well, what are all the other first-person shooters out there? How can we be unique still? How can we make a difference? And I think Perfect Dark, I mean, to me, there's a weird analogy there with Duke Nukem 3D, right? The cool thing about Duke Nukem 3D back then was that it had so much variety. You were used to Doom, and suddenly, like in Duke, you could do all these things. You could set traps, and a lot of that stuff, like Half-Life then took over, right? Like, I could set these laser traps, right? And I can destroy buildings in there, and all of that stuff. And then you know, it's really difficult to follow up on that. With Perfect Dark, I think it would be really, really difficult to kind of like pitch that as not a first-person shooter. And then at the same time, again, well, find a developer who would actually do that, like make a Perfect Dark 3 and make that successful. And right now, like, honestly, if you put Rare on that right now, I don't know if they could deliver that. They have zero experience right now with first-person shooters.
Yeah, so and the rumors that we've heard is that the Coalition Gears developers are the ones that might be working on it, and I think that might be where some of the third-person perspective comes from. But for me, you know, when I think of Perfect Dark, it's not so much the fact that it was an FPS. I played the shit out of Perfect Dark on the N64. Perfect Dark Zero was such a huge disappointment to me. I actually rebooted it like a month or so ago, and it still feels like you're aiming in squares. Like, it's really horrible to control. It drives me nuts.
It was a terrible game.
It was terrible. It was just, but it had some cool ideas. But the reason I think Perfect Dark would work as a third person is I wouldn't want to fully lean into like a Splinter Cell, Metal Gear Solid, but it could be an IP, an intellectual property that could fuel a action adventure game that arguably is a gap in Microsoft's catalog. In that. You know, they kind of tried to make Tomb Raider Xbox centric. You know, Tomb Raider was to Xbox what Uncharted is to PlayStation. Whereas Perfect Dark, you could have these kind of really cool stealth spy missions with all the cool stuff that I loved about Perfect Dark, with the tiered objectives depending upon difficulty, the interaction with the environment, the really crazy cool gadgets and weapons like the laptop gun and fast sight gun and all that sort of stuff. I don't feel that Perfect Dark has to be a first-person shooter. And plus, you know, you've got the cool female lead, the kind of British secret agent slant. It just feels like it could work as a third-person game to me.
I think
it would use the name to sell itself. It wouldn't be Perfect Dark.
That's what I just wanted to get into. I think the other thing you guys need to actually think about is Perfect Dark is a name that you guys know because you're all old farts, similar to me, right? Where that used to be a big name, you know, during the N64 days. That was 20 something years ago, right?
Yeah.
And nowadays, like, if you talk to kids today, right? Like 15, 20-year-olds and so on. Do they really know Perfect Dark? You know, does the name really sell it? You would really have to come up with a concept that is super fresh, that actually works, that can sustain itself without relying on its name, you know? Because I don't think the name actually would do that much for you. The same is true for... I'll give you let's talk about something interesting. Let's talk about something really, really interesting. So I don't know if I didn't sign an NDA, so let's actually talk about this for a second. So a couple of months ago, someone from Disney reached out to us and were asking if we would be interested in one of their ideas, one of their IPs. And honestly, at that point, I kind of like really thought, hey, some of our guys in the studio would be passionate about making a 3D platform anyway, right? And wouldn't it be cool to make a Mickey Mouse game, right? To me, Mickey Mouse was always like, when I grew up, 16-bit games days, right? You had Castle of Illusion. World of Illusion was a little bit worse than that, but like, I think Disney had a real chance there to turn Mickey Mouse into the next Mario, right? If they would have done it right, if they would have had the right developers on it, that could have delivered on Nintendo quality. And that could have been interesting. At the same time, like what really popped into my mind is this thing of like, who in the world knows Mickey Mouse at that point, right? Like in the 90s, it was huge.
That's it.
Yeah, in the 90s it was huge, but now Disney hasn't pushed that IP in a long time. Like, yeah, it's still the House of Mouse, but even that, like, when was the last time you heard that term? But really, like, it wouldn't be that big of a thing anymore, right? Like, I mean, I honestly, I really didn't like what Warren Spector did with Epic Mickey. I think that was just weak compared to Mario Galaxy and so on, right? And obviously, like, that's a huge challenge. Like, I mean, good luck if you're a developer and you have to compete with Mario Galaxy or Nintendo in that sense. But there is an argument to be made that you could make a platformer, you know, that is a Mickey Mouse thing that could compete with Nintendo if you have the right developer on it and so on. And I mean, it was just a thing that came up, right? A thing that popped into our heads. But it's like, I would really enjoy that at some point to work on a 3D platformer and maybe do something like a Mickey Mouse game. At the same time, that's where the whole business thing comes in, right? Even as a developer, like if I would work with Microsoft on an IP, then, and that's the thing that gamers usually don't think about, is well, what do they want for it, right? Like if there's somebody out there who could make a really great Perfect Dark, right? Let's say they come up with an incredible pitch, an incredible concept, have an awesome prototype, right? And then Microsoft comes to them and tells them, okay, well, we'll take 60% of your royalties from that because it's our game, it's our IP, you know, like we put a ton of value into that, right? And I would immediately say, no, that doesn't make any business sense anymore, right? And I don't know exactly what the deals would be with Disney and so on, but I would assume that you would have that problem, right? That it's like, even if they give you a good deal on the first one, who tells you that you could actually be secure, right? That if it becomes a huge success and you would want to make a sequel, that Disney wouldn't just turn around and say, oh, nice that you made this game for us. Obviously, Mickey Mouse is our IP. We gave you a really good deal on the first one. This time around, you know, you used the Mickey IP. We think the game was successful because you used our IP. Now we'll take 80% of your royalties, right? And it's like, well, that's, as a developer, suddenly I'm like, okay, well, you fucked me on this, right? And I think a lot of developers would also be scared of that. That's also like, honestly, I mean, we have an incredible relationship with Microsoft. I would also be scared of that with Microsoft, right? Like who's telling me that couldn't happen if we would tackle a Banjo Kazooie at some point, right? That Microsoft would just say, well, actually it's our IP. And, you know, now we're gonna screw you on the deal, you know, like that could happen. That those business aspects that never come to life
is like that.
It never comes to light, right? But that could easily happen. And for us, like, it doesn't make sense. That's why we're now in the state where it's like, no, we want to own the IP that we're making. And actually, as a business, we're much better off just creating our own IPs, doing our own stuff, right? Simply because, well, we own that then, and we decide the fate of that stuff. Versus, hey, actually, we could get screwed by a publisher. And even if fans would love it, there is a real business case to be made there, where it's like you could really set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't take the business side into account at all. Like they think it's just
we don't
it's
know
all
it
for us.
We ultimately don't know it.
Yeah, the business side is just a mystery to most people.
So given what we just discussed in the top 5 and everything, let's assume hypothetically now we're in a perfect world where no one's screwing anyone over and all that sort of stuff.
What a world.
If Microsoft came to you now, to Moon Studios, and said, you know what, guys, we absolutely love you. Ori's brilliant. We love what you do. Pick any IP of ours that you want to bring back.
I think we're in that state. Like if I would email Phil Spencer right now and I would tell them, hey, guys, dude, we're really interested in taking this Microsoft IP and we want to make that big. I think he has that trust in us that whatever we do, we'll do a good job at it. We are in that state. Like I think I think he would be really happy partnering with us again, especially now, if Will of the Wisps comes out and it becomes, another huge success. Great, why wouldn't he do that, right? But at the same, it goes back again, to what I just said, right? That it's like, would I really want to take that risk? Because it could be that even if I would be excited about some Microsoft IP, that I do it and then suddenly, on the next game or something, if I wanna do something different now, or want to put it on some other platform and so on, they just control everything, right? And I can't, or it doesn't make sense. Actually, it doesn't make any business sense. Even if it would make an incredible amount of sense in terms of what the fans want, right, and the commercial thing behind it, it might not make sense in terms of the studio and keeping the business running, right? So we're definitely that's definitely something you always have to take into account. There's a lot of stuff right now out there with people making remakes over remakes and all these old IPs have to be brought back, right? But actually, in a lot of ways, it just made a ton of sense, especially for studios like Moon, to say, well, screw that, we don't want to deal with that. We just want to do our own stuff and be the master of our domain and really control the fate of those IPs. And hopefully at some point, those games become something, something like that, right? Honestly, with Ori, let's see where Will of the Wisps ends up, right? We don't have any deal or anything for Ori 3 yet. And who knows where that'll go. The IP is actually owned by Microsoft. So it could easily be that, 10 years from now, you guys will still run this podcast and you'll talk to this other studio who's like, oh, are you guys interested in doing another Ori? Because people love that, right? Who knows?
Okay. But what would you pick, though, if you had the choice? So in a perfect world,
theoretically,
hypothetically, if it was open, if Phil came to you and said, you know what, take your pick, we trust you wholeheartedly, pick whatever Microsoft IP you want and make it.
It'd be like Voodoo Vince 2. Let's do it.
No.
I am pretty certain I would pick Banjo Kazooie.
Yeah.
Because I think if you would actually take Moon Studios and look at we made platformers for the past 10 years. We know how to make super tight level designs. I'm certain we could make a Banjo 3 that would get a 90 Metacritic, that would make fans freak the hell out, just imagine that at E3, you see Banjo 3 from the makers of Ori and the Blind Forest and so on. And just visually we could totally knock it out of the park and so on. But again, there are real business aspects there to consider. And at the end of the day, I'm also running a studio, I need to make sure that, hey, we're actually making really smart moves. And even if fans would love, a certain thing, or us tackling something like that, I have to think about all this stuff, right? I have to make sure that, hey, this could take us a good 4 years, 5 years. And what happens then?
Yeah.
I just think with Banjo, and I mentioned this in my top 5 on the website, I feel like with Banjo, the time is right. Strike while the iron is hot. Nintendo got everyone excited about Banjo again, having him in Smash. And I think that showed that people still love Banjo a lot.
It makes me wonder if there is a game in development that we just don't know about.
There were all these rumors this E3, right, where people were like, hey, another Banjo is in development and so on. And I got really excited. I read those rumors and I was like, I hope Microsoft does that. That would make a lot of sense. Them doing another 3D platformer. Yeah. Hopefully they found some studio that does that, right? And that's how we got to talk to Microsoft like and bring up this idea of like, hey, Phil, hypothetically, if you'd want to do that, would you be in, like would you want to do that? And yeah, I would love to see that. I do think Banjo could be huge, but you would need to find a developer who could make a game that could compete with something like Mario Odyssey,
Yeah.
And that's unbelievably difficult. Like, honestly, if I would ask you right now, find a studio that could do that, like, good luck. I mean, it's tough.
It's so true. And then there are less and less independent studios of that caliber out there. I mean, and no offense to the guys working on Terminator, right? Terminator is a huge movie IP, and yet the guys that developed that awful Rambo game somehow have that as a deal. It's like imagine Terminator as an IP in the hands of a developer that could really do something amazing with it. You'll never see it because it costs too much. It's too much of a business risk, for the studio to take. I
actually talked to
crazy.
Ken Law about something similar back then. Like, do you guys know why Rare didn't do Tomorrow Never Dies as a follow-up to GoldenEye?
No.
It was because a lot of the money that they made on GoldenEye went straight to the composer of that Bond theme. And they were just like, yeah, well, we're not going to do that. That's stupid. Like, we're not going to do another Bond game where a lot of the royalties, like, we made the game, it's successful because of us, because we made a great game. And now, like, all our royalties go to that guy because, well, he made some great deal at some point, right? Yeah. And I mean, you probably have a similar thing going on with Rambo, right? Oh, sorry, with Terminator there, where it's like, I don't know what the business behind that is. Like, maybe James Cameron has the whole hands on that, right? It's like, if you make a great Terminator game, James Cameron takes 60% of your royalties.
Yeah.
Who knows? I mean,
that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually, honestly, those are the kind of things, like, whenever you read forums like XboxEra and so on, right? There's definitely a whole lot of misunderstanding of how the business, like the actual game's business works, because nobody knows, right? Because you only learn that by getting beaten down a couple of times, and like, nobody actually has access to those dealings and so on. I actually really like, I mean, I know he's a controversial figure, right? But I actually really like what Michael Pachter brought to the table with giving people a little bit of understanding of, guys, this is how this industry works. This is how the business works. Let's actually talk about that for a little bit, because it's also interesting, like, we have agents from UTA. There are a lot of times, like, agents in this industry are the unsung heroes, right? Like, simply because we would not be, I can honestly tell you, we would not be where we are right now and be a studio that has 80 people there, that has, like, that is working on Will of the Wisps and the Secret Project and has all of that lined up and so on. If it wouldn't be for our agents at UTA, like Ophir and Blake, our guys, they're just unbelievably useful to our studio. And I would love to see that getting a little bit more exposure, like the whole business dealings and, like, why did this deal not happen, or that kind of stuff. Because I'm sure there must be a gazillion of really interesting stories to tell of projects that almost happened and didn't, right, because of this silly business thing. And yeah, if you read forums like we said around those kind of things, it's always just from the gamer perspective and, like, this makes a lot of sense. Why hasn't anybody made this yet, right? And then obviously a lot of times it could be for a very simple reason, right? It's like, well, it didn't make sense business-wise. We couldn't come to an agreement, and
it'd be nice if everything could work that way. Like, yeah, sure, take the IP, no worries.
Yeah, exactly. And usually people don't take that into account, or they don't understand it, right? Or, like, I mean, there are publishers out there, and I'm not going to name names, right, where they literally offer you deals where it's like, hey, you make a game for us, great, we'll take 96% of your royalties. And I'm like, what the hell do you, like, how in the world would I run a business if you take all the money and I get nothing? And I would love for platforms to exist where that gets a little bit more exposure, because also I think it would help developers to actually get fair deals. Because the same is true, I think, in all forms of media. I think it's still like that in publishing, in normal book publishing, right? Where it's like, if you write a great book, if you make the next great novel or something, what really happens is you have to hope to God that some publisher will be gracious enough to actually publish your book. and they will then do that for like 90% of your royalties or something, where if you're lucky, you get 10%. And it's like, there are tons of authors out there where it's like, hey, they wrote something great and they made no money, and it's like, now would you do it again if you do that? Where it's like, hey, I made this great book, everybody knows it, now I'm bankrupt, it's like,
and it's the same when those, because the publishers have the rights to the IP, and then the author, if it gets made into a movie, the publisher is still making the majority of the money, even though it's the author's work that's going into the film. It's crazy how IP actually fuels a lot of the stuff behind the scenes that arguably no one really pays attention to. It's all the dollar signs running around in the cogs in the machine.
I mean, I hate that aspect of it. I really, really despise, which is also why, our agents are so useful to us, because there's nothing worse to me than having to read through 70-page contracts or something like that, right? With that are all written in legalese and so on. And that whole aspect, and I think that's also why a lot of independent studios actually are not independent anymore, because it's a huge pain in the ass to deal with that aspect of it, to deal with payroll, to deal with all the contractual stuff and making sure that is there. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of studios, like, why do you create a studio? Because you want to, work on cool stuff and be creative and so on, until it really hits you that actually I have to run a business, actually people need to be paid. I need to pay, people need to pay rent. They need to have healthcare. You need to pay them a decent wage. You also need to make sure that your team, like that the culture in the studio is good, that everybody feels like you care for them and so on. That kind of thing is, like that is actually super important. I see a lot of people that start, like that try to do the indie thing, and then, they start a company and then suddenly it hits them that it's like, oh my God, I have to run a company, that whole aspect of it is actually really, really difficult. And that's also why it's really difficult to find not just talent, but a studio that actually managed to do that part, right? Like to actually successfully run a business and also be really good at game development and are able to do all of that stuff and deliver that. That's also something that usually, people don't talk about, but there is a real business aspect to all of this. And that's just the world that we're in, right? Capitalism, like, hey, people need to get paid.
Yeah.
And it fucking sucks that we do have to do that.
Yeah,
that's politics discussion for another day.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, we've taken up a lot of your time.
That's fine. It was really fun. Honestly, it flew by. Like, this was really fun.
Yeah, we often say, we'll try and keep it sweet, 90 minutes, and then it's like 4 hours later. I'm already in the doghouse because I came back from the States Thursday morning, and my wife was like, I've cooked you dinner and stuff. And then my best mate just turned up and was like, hey, you want to hang out for a couple of days? And I was like, so she's cross with me. And then yesterday she went, have you got the podcast on Sunday? And I just looked at her and went, yes. So I said to her, I'll be done by 11. I'm like, it's 12:30. I'm dead. Yeah. If you don't see me,
I'm actually going through all this stuff right now. I had the glorious idea of like, hey, we work on Will of the Wisps. And by the way, at the same time, we wanted to have this other project that needed to get signed, right? And then, we had this glorious idea of like, hey, wouldn't it be fun to have a kid finally? And so my son was born in 2018, January 2018. So
congratulations.
I'm dealing with all those things now.
It's so much crazy. Fun. Goodbye,
sleep.
It's
super awesome. It's super awesome. But that has been so true for me. Like, honestly, I mean, Will of the Wisps has been the hardest project I ever worked on. Easily, simply because so many things came in. And I'm super proud of what we did so far, right? But I mean, it's been such a hard project because a lot of times, like, you're operating under, like today, I like a lot of days now I operate with like 4 hours of sleep, and it's like, oh my God, you really feel like a boxer who's just has to have a match every single day, right? And it's just, oh my God, like that's the thing with running a game studio and like making games, that if you're not really passionate, if there isn't something crazy, like if you're not that kind of insane that you're okay with that, you're not gonna make it. Like it's just, it's too hard. It's way too hard if you're not super in love with what you're doing.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, look, we thoroughly appreciate that you've taken so much of your time out to come and chat with us. When does Will of the Wisps release? Just for those listening.
February 11th next year.
February 11th next year.
It's not much long anymore. It's really soon.
No delays, please. No more delays.
Yeah, I can't wait to play this bad boy. Look, massive appreciate it, Thomas. As always, for those listening, if you give us a like and a follow on Twitter and on YouTube and all of that usual stuff, and we will see you next time. Yep. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.